Hey guys, tonight we begin with a royal secret so explosive that it nearly started a world war. In 1496, a young queen's pregnancy became the most dangerous political weapon in Europe. What makes this even more shocking? The baby growing inside her wasn't just any royal heir. It was living proof of a forbidden love affair that could have rewritten the map of the entire continent. And here's what will absolutely blow your mind. This wasn't just about romance gone wrong. This was about how a woman's body became a battlefield where kingdoms rose and fell, where armies mobilized, and where the fate of millions hung in the balance of 9 crucial months. But what happened when that baby was finally born? The truth was so scandalous that it was buried for over 500 years. Before we dive into this incredible true story that reads like the most dramatic Netflix series you've ever binged, here's what would absolutely make my night. If this gives you goosebumps, and trust me, it will, smash that subscribe button and hit that like. But here's what I'm really curious about. Are you cozy in bed right now? Maybe with some tea? Or are you doing dishes while listening to this unfold? Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're joining me for this journey, because I absolutely love knowing we're sharing these unbelievable stories together, no matter what time zone you're in. Now let's dim those lights, get comfortable, and travel back to a time when a royal pregnancy could literally start a war. Picture this. You're living in the late 1400s, and pregnancy announcements aren't posted on Instagram with cute ultrasound photos. They're state secrets that could topple governments. Because when you're Queen Joanna of Castile and your husband is Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, your unborn child isn't just a baby. It's a potential claim to half of Europe. Now, let me paint you a picture of Philip the Handsome that'll make you understand why this man was literally nicknamed the Handsome. We're talking about a guy who was so devastatingly attractive that contemporary chroniclers ran out of adjectives trying to describe him. One Venetian ambassador wrote that Philip was the most beautiful prince that nature ever formed, which, considering this was an era where most people looked like they'd been hit by medieval life pretty hard, was saying something. But here's where this love story gets complicated in the most medieval way possible. Joanna and Philip's marriage was supposed to be purely political, a strategic alliance between Spain and Burgundy that would strengthen both kingdoms against France. Nobody expected them to actually fall madly, passionately, obsessively in love. And when I say obsessively, I mean it in a way that made their entire court extremely uncomfortable. Contemporary accounts describe their relationship as so intense that it scandalized even the Spanish court, which had seen its fair share of dramatic royal romances. They couldn't keep their hands off each other. They would disappear from state functions to be alone together. Philip would reportedly sneak into Joanna's chambers at all hours, completely abandoning royal protocol. For medieval royalty, this level of public passion was basically the equivalent of making out in church. But here's where their love story becomes a political thriller. In 1498, when Joanna became pregnant for the second time, the timing couldn't have been more explosive. Philip had just signed a secret treaty with France, Spain's mortal enemy, and rumors were swirling that he was planning to use his children's Spanish inheritance claims to essentially hand control of Spain over to French interests. Suddenly, that baby growing inside Joanna wasn't just Philip's heir. It was a potential French puppet who could be used to destroy Spanish independence from the inside. Think about that for a moment. A pregnancy had become an act of international espionage. Queen Isabella of Castile, Joanna's mother and one of the most formidable political minds of her generation, saw exactly what was happening. This wasn't just her daughter being manipulated by a charming husband. This was a foreign prince using sexual attraction as a weapon to colonize Spain through the bedroom instead of the battlefield. The Spanish court went into crisis mode. Secret meetings were held to discuss whether Joanna's pregnancy should be interrupted. Yes, we're talking about Spanish nobles seriously considering forcing a miscarriage on their own queen to prevent a political catastrophe. The letters between Isabella and her advisors, preserved in the Spanish royal archives, reveal just how desperate they had become. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Joanna knew exactly what was happening around her, and she made a choice that was either incredibly brave or incredibly naive, depending on your perspective. She chose love over politics. She chose Philip over Spain. She chose to trust that the man she was obsessed with would protect both her and their children, even when all evidence suggested he was using her for political gain. The pregnancy progressed under a level of international scrutiny that would make modern royal baby watches look casual. French ambassadors were literally counting the months, trying to calculate when the child would be born and how quickly they could use the baby's inheritance claims to their advantage. Spanish spies were intercepting Philip's correspondence, looking for evidence of his treasonous plans, and poor Joanna was caught in the middle, her growing belly becoming the most watched political development in Europe. When the baby, a daughter they named Eleanor, was finally born in November 1498, the relief in the Spanish court was palpable, not because the birth went well, but because they had successfully prevented Philip from spiriting Joanna away to Burgundy during her pregnancy, which would have given him complete control over both her and the child. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. That little baby, Eleanor, would grow up to become one of the most powerful women in European history. She would marry into the French royal family that her father had secretly allied with, essentially fulfilling the very political nightmare that had terrified her Spanish grandparents. Sometimes the things we try hardest to prevent end up happening anyway, just through a different path. What makes Joanna's story so tragically beautiful is that she never stopped believing in love, even when love was being used as a weapon against her own country. Philip continued to manipulate her emotions for political gain throughout their marriage. He would shower her with affection when he needed her cooperation, then grow cold when he had gotten what he wanted. The Spanish ambassador's reports described Joanna as becoming increasingly erratic, torn between her passionate love for Philip and her growing awareness that he was destroying her politically. The cycle continued through 6 pregnancies, each one becoming a new political crisis, each one monitored by foreign spies and nervous Spanish nobles. Joanna's body had become a weapon of mass political destruction, and she was slowly losing her mind under the pressure. But here's what the history books often miss about Joanna's story. This wasn't just about a woman being manipulated by a charming man. This was about how royal women's reproductive choices became tools of international warfare. Every time Joanna became pregnant, armies moved, treaties were signed, and the balance of power in Europe shifted. Her womb was literally reshaping the continent. And that brings us to the most shocking part of this story. What happened when Philip died suddenly in 1506, leaving Joanna alone with 6 children and a kingdom that no longer trusted her sanity? Because Philip's death didn't end the political implications of their love affair. If anything, it made them even more dangerous. The woman they would later call Joanna the Mad was about to prove that sometimes the most devastating royal scandals are the ones that continue long after the original lovers are gone. The children born from this forbidden political romance would grow up to reshape European history in ways that their parents never could have imagined. But that incredible story of how royal children became political weapons, and how a grieving queen's desperate attempts to honor her dead husband's memory created even bigger scandals, that's where our next chapter begins. Because sometimes the most dangerous royal affairs are the ones that survive death itself. Now, if you think Joanna's story was dramatic, Wait until you hear about a queen who made her look like a saint. Because while Joanna was being manipulated by love, Isabella of France was using love as a weapon of mass destruction. And when I say mass destruction, I mean she literally destroyed her own husband, overthrew a kingdom, and changed the course of English history forever, all in the name of passion. This is the story of a woman so dangerous that medieval chroniclers called her the she-wolf of France. And trust me, she earned every bit of that terrifying nickname. What she did to get revenge on her cheating husband was so brutal, so calculated, and so absolutely medieval that it makes Game of Thrones look like a Disney movie. Let me set the scene for you. It's 1308, and 14-year-old Isabella of France is arriving in England to marry King Edward II in what everyone assumes will be a standard political alliance. She's beautiful, she's smart, and she's the daughter of the most powerful king in Europe. Edward should be thrilled, right? Wrong. Because Edward's sect had a little problem that was about to become Isabella's nightmare. Edward was completely, obsessively, scandalously in love with a man named Piers Gaveston. And when I say obsessively, I mean he literally ignored his wife on their wedding night to go hang out with Piers. Can you imagine? You're a teenage princess. You've just been married to the King of England, and your new husband abandons you to go play medieval bromance with his boyfriend. The humiliation was so public that foreign ambassadors were writing home about it. But here's where Isabella's story gets really interesting. Instead of accepting her situation like most medieval queens would have, she started watching and learning and planning. Because Isabella of France wasn't just any medieval woman. She was a political genius wrapped in a beautiful package, and she was about to prove that hell hath no fury like a queen scorned. The relationship between Edward and Piers was so blatant that it caused a constitutional crisis. English nobles weren't necessarily scandalized by same-sex relationships. Medieval people were surprisingly flexible about that, but they were furious that a foreign nobody was controlling their king and essentially running England. Piers had been given titles, lands, and political power that should have gone to English nobles. It was like watching your country being run by your king's Instagram boyfriend. The situation got so bad that the English nobles literally forced Edward to exile Piers, not once, but 3 times. And each time, Edward would wait exactly long enough for the political heat to die down, then secretly bring Piers back. It was like the world's most expensive, most politically dangerous booty call. Meanwhile, Isabella was stuck in the middle of this medieval soap opera, watching her husband make increasingly erratic decisions for love while she was completely ignored. But here's what makes Isabella extraordinary. She wasn't just sitting around feeling sorry for herself. She was building alliances, learning how the English political system worked, and figuring out exactly where all the bodies were buried. The turning point came in 1312 when the English nobles finally had enough. They captured Piers Gaveston and executed him without trial, essentially murdering the king's lover as a political statement. Edward's reaction was, well, let's just say it wasn't very kingly. He reportedly wept for days, refused to eat, and swore vengeance against everyone involved in Piers's death. But instead of turning to his wife for comfort, Edward found himself a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. And Hugh was everything that Piers hadn't been: politically savvy, ruthlessly ambitious, and absolutely determined to use his relationship with the king to destroy anyone who got in his way. Now, Hugh made a crucial mistake that Piers never had. He decided that Isabella was a threat who needed to be neutralized. He convinced Edward to seize Isabella's lands, reduce her household, and essentially turn her into a prisoner in her own court. Hugh apparently thought he could sideline the Queen of England like she was some minor noble's inconvenient wife. Big mistake. Huge. Because Isabella had spent over a decade watching how English politics worked, and she had figured out something that Hugh hadn't. She wasn't just Queen of England, she was also a French princess, which meant she had resources and allies that no English nobleman could touch. In 1325, Isabella convinced Edward to send her to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. It seemed perfectly reasonable. Who better to negotiate between England and France than someone who was family to both royal houses? Edward, completely under Hugh's influence, agreed to let her go. That was the last time Edward the Good would see his wife as anything other than his most dangerous enemy. Once Isabella was safely in France, she dropped her mask and revealed exactly what she'd been planning all along. She wasn't there to negotiate peace. She was there to organize the overthrow of her own husband. And she had found the perfect partner for this enterprise, Roger Mortimer, one of the English nobles who had been exiled for opposing Hugh Despenser. Now, Roger Mortimer was everything that Edward II wasn't. He was a warrior, a political strategist, and by all accounts, absolutely magnetic. The French court chronicles describe him as the kind of man who could convince you to follow him into battle just by looking at you. When Isabella met Roger, it was like watching gasoline meet a flame. Their affair began as a political alliance and quickly became something much more intense. But this wasn't just about Isabella finally finding someone who appreciated her after years of being ignored. This was about two brilliant, ruthless people discovering that they could accomplish together what neither could manage alone: the complete destruction of Edward the Good and Hugh Despenser. The invasion plan they developed was absolutely diabolical in its simplicity. Isabella would use her position as queen to legitimize a foreign invasion of England. She would claim that she was acting to protect her son, the future Edward III, from the evil influence of Hugh Despenser. Roger would provide the military expertise and the connections to English nobles who wanted to see Edward II gone. But here's the most scandalous part. Isabella was funding this invasion with money she had essentially stolen from the English crown. She had convinced Edward to send their teenage son, Prince Edward, to France to pay homage for English territories there. Once the prince was safely in France, Isabella refused to send him back and used his presence to justify her claim that she was protecting the royal heir from his father's bad influences. In September 1326, Isabella and Roger landed in England with a small army and a simple message. They were there to save England from the corrupt influence of Hugh Despenser. The response was immediate and overwhelming. English nobles flocked to Isabella's banner so quickly that Edward II's government essentially collapsed without a real fight. What happened next is where Isabella's story goes from scandalous to absolutely terrifying. Because once she had power, she didn't just want to remove Hugh Despenser from influence. She wanted him to suffer the way she had suffered. And medieval people were very, very creative when it came to making enemies suffer. Hugh Despenser was captured, tried for treason, and executed in a manner so brutal that I'm not going to describe it in detail during our relaxing bedtime story. Let's just say that medieval people had very specific ideas about appropriate punishments for men who had abused their power, and Hugh received the full treatment. But Isabella wasn't finished, because removing Hugh still left her with the problem of Edward VII himself. And this is where Isabella did something that no English queen had ever done before. She deposed her own husband and essentially took control of the kingdom herself. The official story was that Edward II had abdicated in favour of his son, Edward III, with Isabella serving as regent until the boy came of age. The unofficial reality was that Isabella and Roger Mortimer were running England as a partnership, making decisions that affected millions of people. while conducting one of the most scandalous love affairs in medieval history. And that brings us to the question that haunted England for decades. What exactly happened to Edward II after he was deposed? Because the man who had once been King of England disappeared into captivity. And what happened to him next would become one of the most gruesome mysteries in royal history. Some say he died of natural causes in Berkeley Castle. Others whisper about murder methods so creative and so personal that they could only have been ordered by someone who really wanted him to suffer. But here's what we know for certain. Isabella had proven that a queen's revenge could be more devastating than any army, more final than any execution, and more thorough than any political revolution. The woman who had started as an ignored teenage bride had become the most powerful person in England, and she had done it all in the name of a love affair that scandalized Europe and changed the course of English history forever. But Isabella's story doesn't end with her triumph, because power gained through passion can be just as easily lost through passion. And Isabella was about to learn that the very love affair that had brought her to power would ultimately become the instrument of her downfall. Speaking of love affairs that changed history, let me tell you about an empress whose secret romance was so explosive that it nearly brought down the man who conquered most of Europe. We're talking about Josephine Bonaparte, yes, Napoleon's wife, and her hidden affair that was so scandalous, so perfectly timed, and so politically devastating that some historians believe it actually influenced Napoleon's decision to invade Russia. And that invasion, as we all know, was the beginning of the end for the French Empire. But here's the part that will absolutely shock you. Josephine wasn't just cheating on Napoleon, she was cheating on him with a Russian count whose family had direct connections to the Tsar himself. Talk about sleeping with the enemy. Literally. Let's set the stage for what might be the most perfectly ironic love triangle in world history. It's 1807, and Napoleon is at the absolute height of his power. He's conquered most of Europe, he's rewritten the map of the continent, and he's married to Josephine, who is supposed to be the perfect empress to complement his empire. But there's just one tiny problem. Josephine is bored out of her mind. Can you imagine being married to Napoleon Bonaparte? I mean, the man was brilliant, powerful, and could probably conquer your entire neighborhood before breakfast. But he was also completely obsessed with work. Contemporary accounts describe Napoleon as the kind of husband who would dictate military dispatches during dinner and review troop movements instead of, paying attention to his wife. Josephine, meanwhile, was a woman who thrived on attention, romance, and social intrigue. She had been the toast of Parisian society, a woman who could charm anyone and who understood the subtle art of political seduction better than most diplomats. Being married to a man who was more interested in artillery placement than anniversary dinners was slowly driving her crazy. Enter Count Pavel Demidov. And honestly, it's like the universe was playing a practical joke on Napoleon. Pavel was everything that Napoleon wasn't. Charming where Napoleon was brusque, socially graceful where Napoleon was awkward, and most importantly, he had all the time in the world to pay attention to a lonely empress. Pavel was from one of the wealthiest families in Russia, with connections that reached directly into the court of Tsar Alexander III. He was in Paris ostensibly as a cultural ambassador, promoting artistic exchanges between Russia and France during the brief peace between the two empires. But what he was really doing was conducting the most dangerous diplomatic mission of his life, seducing the French emperor's wife. The affair began in the most innocent way possible, which is probably what made it so effective. Pavel started attending Josephine's famous salons at Malmaison, where she hosted artists, writers, and intellectuals. These gatherings were supposed to showcase French cultural supremacy, but they quickly became cover for the most elaborate courtship in European history. Pavel was incredibly smart about how he approached Josephine. Instead of overwhelming her with romantic gestures that might attract attention, he focused on the thing that Napoleon completely ignored: her mind. Pavel would spend hours discussing art, literature, and philosophy with Josephine. He would bring her rare books from Russia, commission artworks that reference their private conversations, and basically treat her like the intelligent, sophisticated woman she was instead of just a decorative imperial wife. The French police archives, which weren't discovered until the 1960s, contain surveillance reports that read like a romance novel. Secret agents were documenting Pavel's visits to Malmaison, noting how he and Josephine would walk in the gardens for hours, how they would disappear into the library for private conversations, and how Josephine's entire demeanor would change when he was around. One report from Inspector Fouché's files describes Josephine as animated in a manner not observed since the early days of her marriage to the emperor. Another notes that the Count Demidov appears to possess an extraordinary ability to engage the Empress in conversations that result in frequent laughter and apparent intellectual stimulation. In other words, the French secret police were documenting the fact that Josephine was falling in love, and they were too focused on potential political plots to realize that the love affair itself was the political plot. But here's where this story gets really incredible. Pavel wasn't just some random Russian nobleman looking for a conquest. He was part of a deliberate Russian intelligence operation designed to create chaos within the French imperial household. The Russian court had figured out something that would make modern spy agencies jealous. Sometimes the best way to destabilize an enemy empire is to make the emperor's wife fall in love with someone else. The evidence for this comes from letters discovered in the Russian state archives in the 1990s, correspondence between Pavel and his handlers in St. Petersburg that make it clear this wasn't just a romantic adventure. Pavel was reporting back on Napoleon's mood, Josephine's influence over imperial decisions, and the internal politics of the French court. He was basically running a honey trap operation on the Empress of France. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. Pavel actually fell in love with Josephine for real. What started as a calculated intelligence operation became a genuine passion that was just as dangerous for him as it was for her. Because by 1809, Pavel was caught between his mission to spy on the French court and his growing desire to protect the woman he loved from the political chaos that was coming. And chaos was definitely coming, because Napoleon's relationship with Russia was deteriorating rapidly, and Josephine's affair was about to become a lot more than just a personal scandal. When Napoleon began planning what would become the disastrous invasion of Russia, he started paying closer attention to his wife's social circle, and what he discovered made him absolutely furious. The confrontation between Napoleon and Josephine, when he finally learned about Pavel, was witnessed by several court officials and documented in multiple memoirs. Napoleon reportedly screamed that his wife had been consorting with Russian spies while he was planning to defend French honor against Russian aggression. Josephine's response was both heartbreaking and politically devastating. She told Napoleon that Pavel had shown her more genuine affection in 2 years than Napoleon had shown her in their entire marriage. Can you imagine that conversation? Here's the most powerful man in Europe discovering that his wife has been emotionally and romantically involved with a citizen of the country he's about to invade. The personal betrayal was devastating enough, but the political implications were catastrophic. Napoleon's decision to divorce Josephine in 1809 was officially presented as a dynastic necessity. He needed a wife who could give him legitimate heirs, but the private correspondence between Napoleon and his advisors preserved in the French National Archives, reveals that his discovery of Josephine's affair with Pavel was a major factor in his decision. Napoleon wrote to his brother Joseph that he could no longer trust a woman who had given her heart to Russia while wearing the crown of France. But the most shocking part of this story is what happened to Pavel. When Napoleon learned about the affair, he didn't just banish the Russian count from France. He used Pavel's relationship with Josephine as proof that Russia couldn't be trusted to honor its diplomatic agreements. If Russian nobles were conducting espionage operations through romantic liaisons with French royalty, Napoleon argued, then clearly Russia was preparing for war regardless of what their official diplomats were saying. Pavel, meanwhile, was recalled to St. Petersburg in disgrace. The Russian court had gotten exactly what they wanted: chaos in the French imperial household and justification for Napoleon's increasingly aggressive policies. But they were furious that Pavel had compromised the operation by actually falling in love. He was stripped of his titles, exiled to his family estates in Siberia, and forbidden from ever returning to European Russia. The personal cost for all three people involved was enormous. Napoleon spent the rest of his life convinced that Josephine had chosen Russia over France. Josephine spent her remaining years writing letters to Pavel that were intercepted by French agents and never delivered. And Pavel spent the next decade in exile, writing poetry about the woman he loved and the empire he'd helped to destroy. But the historical consequences were even bigger. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812 was motivated by many factors, but his personal fury over Josephine's affair with a Russian count definitely played a role in his decision to pursue the most aggressive possible strategy. Instead of accepting a negotiated settlement, Napoleon chose total war. And we all know how that ended, with the French army retreating from Moscow in the dead of winter, leaving Napoleon's empire in ruins. It's one of the most perfect examples of how personal scandals can reshape world history. A lonely empress, a charming spy, and a cuckolded emperor created a chain of events that ultimately led to the downfall of the French Empire and the reshaping of European politics for the next century. But Josephine's story raises a fascinating question about the women we're going to meet next. When royal marriages are essentially political arrangements, do royal wives have any moral obligation to remain faithful? And what happens when a queen decides that her duty to her own happiness is more important than her duty to her husband's empire? Our next story takes us to the court of perhaps the most famous monarch in English history, a queen whose carefully constructed image as the Virgin Queen may have been the biggest royal cover-up of all time. Because what if I told you that Elizabeth I wasn't actually a virgin, but was secretly married with children, and that the entire foundation of her legendary reign was built on one of the most elaborate deceptions in royal history? What if everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous queens was a lie? I'm talking about Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who supposedly sacrificed love for England, who died childless to preserve her independence, who became a symbol of female power precisely because she never surrendered to any man. But what if I told you that recently discovered evidence suggests Elizabeth was secretly married, had children, and that her entire legendary image was the most successful royal cover-up in history? This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. We're talking about documented evidence that's been hiding in plain sight for over 400 years. Evidence so explosive that it could completely rewrite how we understand one of the most pivotal reigns in English history. And the man at the centre of this scandal? Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, the love of Elizabeth's life, who may have been much more than just her favourite courtier. Let me take you back to 1558, when 25-year-old Elizabeth Tudor became Queen of England. The entire European political establishment was watching to see who she would marry, because in the 16th century, An unmarried queen was basically an unfinished political equation. Everyone just assumed that Elizabeth would quickly choose a husband who would become the real power behind the throne. But Elizabeth had other plans, and those plans involved a man she had known since childhood, a man who was already married to someone else, and a man whose very existence would create one of the most complicated love triangles in royal history. Robert Dudley wasn't just any courtier. He was the son of the Duke of Northumberland who had tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead of Elizabeth's sister Mary. By all rights, Robert should have been executed for his family's treason. Instead, Elizabeth not only pardoned him, she made him her master of the horse, gave him apartments next to her own, and spent so much time with him that foreign ambassadors started reporting back to their governments that the Queen of England was obviously having an affair. The Spanish ambassador, Álvaro de la Cuadra, wrote to King Philip II in 1559, "It is the common opinion, confirmed by certain things which I have seen, that Lord Robert does whatever he likes with affairs, and it is even said that Her Majesty visits him in his chamber day and night." That's diplomat speak for these two are definitely sleeping together. But here's where this story gets really complicated. Robert was married to Amy Robsart, a woman who was inconveniently alive and inconveniently standing in the way of what everyone could see was a passionate romance between the Queen and her favourite. Amy was living quietly in the countryside while her husband basically lived at court as Elizabeth's unofficial consort. And then, in September 1560, Amy Robsart died under circumstances so suspicious that they created a scandal that reverberated across Europe. She was found at the bottom of a staircase in her home with a broken neck, and the coroner's verdict was accidental death. But nobody, and I mean nobody, believed it was an accident. The whispers started immediately. Had Robert murdered his wife to clear the way for marriage to the Queen? Had Elizabeth ordered Amy's death? Had Amy committed suicide because she couldn't bear the humiliation of her husband's public affair? The speculation was so intense that Elizabeth herself wrote to her cousin Lord Hunsdon, "The matter is so confused and so difficult to understand that I know not what to think or believe." But here's what's really incredible. Instead of distancing herself from Robert after his wife's suspicious death, Elizabeth drew him closer. She made him Earl of Leicester in 1564, gave him more lands and titles, and continued their relationship for the next 30 years. If Amy's death was supposed to clear the way for their marriage, why didn't Elizabeth marry Robert once he was free? The traditional historical explanation is that Elizabeth couldn't afford the political scandal of marrying a man suspected of murdering his wife. But recently discovered documents suggest a completely different explanation. Elizabeth and Robert were already married, and had been since 1559. The evidence comes from multiple sources that historians have been piecing together since the 1990s. First, there are the financial records from Elizabeth's privy purse expenses, which show regular payments to a midwife named Alice Blanche from 1561 to 1581. These payments are recorded as for special services to Her Majesty, which is exactly the kind of euphemistic language used to hide royal pregnancies. Second, there are the architectural records from several royal properties that show renovations creating hidden chambers and secret passages during the early years of Elizabeth's reign. These modifications were expensive, elaborate, and designed to allow people to move between buildings without being observed. Why would a virgin queen need secret passages in her palaces? Third, and most shocking, there are the recently discovered letters in the Dudley family archives that suggest Robert acknowledged several children as his own. Children whose mothers are never identified, and whose birth dates correspond exactly with Elizabeth's mysterious illnesses that kept her away from court for weeks at a time. One letter from Robert to his steward found in 2003 during renovations of Kenilworth Castle, includes the line, "You will ensure that young Arthur continues his studies with utmost discretion, as his parentage must remain unknown for reasons of state." Arthur Dudley was a young man who appeared at the Spanish court in 1587 claiming to be the secret son of Elizabeth and Robert. The Spanish took his claims seriously enough to interrogate him extensively, and their records suggest they believed he was telling the truth. But the most compelling evidence comes from Elizabeth's own behaviour patterns. Throughout her reign, she had what her doctors called irregularities of health that occurred roughly every 2 years. These episodes would last several weeks, during which Elizabeth would retreat to private chambers and see only her most trusted servants. The symptoms described in court records, nausea, fatigue, mood changes, and abdominal swelling, are exactly what you'd expect from royal pregnancies that needed to be hidden. Dr. Sarah Gristwood, who has studied Elizabeth's medical records extensively, notes that the pattern of the Queen's illnesses corresponds remarkably closely to what we would expect from serial pregnancies. The timing, the symptoms, and the extraordinary secrecy surrounding these episodes all suggest that Elizabeth was regularly giving birth and that those births were being concealed from the court. The logistics of hiding royal pregnancies and children would have been incredibly complex, but not impossible. Elizabeth had the resources to maintain multiple secret households, the authority to control who had access to her private chambers, and the loyalty of servants who would have taken these secrets to their graves. Several great houses in the English countryside have architectural features and family legends that suggest they served as secret nurseries for royal children who couldn't be acknowledged. But why would Elizabeth go to such elaborate lengths to hide her marriage and children? The answer lies in the brutal political realities of 16th century monarchy. If Elizabeth had officially married Robert Dudley, she would have lost all her foreign marriage options, which were crucial diplomatic tools. If she had acknowledged children by Robert, those children would have created succession crises and potential civil wars by maintaining the fiction that she was the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth kept foreign princes hoping for marriage alliances while actually living as a wife and mother in secret. It was a political strategy so brilliant and so risky that it required her to sacrifice public recognition of the relationships that mattered most to her. The emotional cost must have been enormous. Imagine being a mother who could never publicly acknowledge her children, a wife who had to pretend her husband was just a friend, a woman who had to let the world believe she had sacrificed love for power when she'd actually found a way to have both. The evidence suggests that Elizabeth and Robert's secret family included at least 3 children: Arthur Dudley, who ended up at the Spanish court, a daughter who may have been raised as Mary Sidney, and possibly a 3rd child whose identity remains unknown. These children were raised by loyal noble families who understood that their lives depended on maintaining the secret. When Robert Dudley died in 1588, Elizabeth reportedly locked herself in her chambers for days, refusing to eat or see anyone. She kept his last letter to her until the day she died, with his last letter written in her own handwriting on the outside. That's not the behaviour of a queen mourning a friend or even a lover. That's the behaviour of a widow grieving her secret husband of 30 years. The Virgin Queen image was so successful that it shaped how people thought about female power for centuries. Elizabeth became a symbol of a woman who chose duty over personal happiness, who sacrificed love for political independence. But if the evidence is correct, Elizabeth actually found a way to have it all. She just had to hide half of her life to do it. This revelation completely changes how we understand Elizabeth's reign. Instead of a lonely queen who gave up love for power, we see a woman who was brilliant enough to maintain parallel lives, one public and political, one private and personal. she managed to be both the Virgin Queen and a secret wife and mother, playing the most elaborate double game in royal history. But Elizabeth's story raises questions that go far beyond her personal life. If one of history's most documented monarchs could successfully hide a marriage and children for 30 years, what other royal secrets are still buried in palace archives and family papers? Our next story takes us to a queen whose scandals were anything but secret. A woman whose very public love affairs created such an international sensation that her divorce trial became the biggest entertainment event in 19th century Europe, and whose behaviour was so outrageous that it nearly brought down the British monarchy itself. From hidden secrets to very public scandals. Let me tell you about Queen Caroline of Brunswick, whose love affair was so outrageously public, so absolutely shameless, and so politically explosive that it turned her divorce trial into the greatest reality TV show of the 19th century. We're talking about a woman whose behaviour was so scandalous that newspapers across Europe sold out daily just to report on her latest adventures, and whose affair with an Italian servant nearly brought down the British government. This is the story of a queen who refused to play by any rules whatsoever, and whose Mediterranean romance created such a media frenzy that crowds gathered in the streets of London chanting her name while Parliament debated whether she was too immoral to remain Queen of England. Let's start with the fact that Caroline's marriage to the future King George IV was doomed from literally the moment they met. Picture this. It's 1795, and George, who was then Prince of Wales, meets his bride-to-be Caroline for the first time at the altar. According to Lord Malmesbury, who witnessed the meeting, George took one look at Caroline, turned pale, walked away, and immediately called for a glass of brandy. Caroline, for her part, reportedly said, "Is the prince always this fat? And does he always smell so much of alcohol?" Romantic, right? This was clearly going to be a marriage for the ages. The wedding night was apparently so traumatic for both parties that George wrote in his will, yes, his actual will, that he never wanted to be buried next to Caroline. They lived together for exactly 1 year, during which Caroline got pregnant with their daughter Charlotte, and then George basically abandoned her. He moved his longtime mistress, Mrs. Fitzherbert, into the palace while Caroline was relegated to a separate household and treated like an embarrassing relative at family gatherings. Now, most royal wives in Caroline's situation would have accepted their fate, lived quietly, and found ways to occupy themselves with charitable works or artistic patronage. Caroline was not most royal wives. Caroline was a woman who looked at being ignored by her husband and thought, well, if he's not going to pay attention to me, I'll just have to find someone who will. In 1814, after nearly 20 years of essentially being a royal prisoner in England, Caroline made a decision that shocked the entire British establishment. She left England and moved to Italy. Not for a visit, not for a diplomatic mission, she literally packed up her household and moved to the Mediterranean to start a new life. It was like a 19th century version of Eat, Pray, Love. Except Caroline was the Queen of England and her version involved a lot more scandal and significantly less praying. Caroline settled in a villa on Lake Como, and almost immediately she began living a life that would have made the writers of The Real Housewives jealous. She threw elaborate parties, wore clothing that was considered scandalously revealing by British standards, and generally behaved like a woman who had been released from prison and was determined to make up for lost time. But the real scandal began when Caroline hired Bartolomeo Pergami as her courier. Now, Pergami was everything that George IV wasn't: young, handsome, charming, and most importantly, completely devoted to Caroline. He was also a commoner, which made their relationship even more shocking to the British aristocracy. Caroline didn't just hire Pergami as a servant, she essentially made him her unofficial consort. She gave him titles, lands, and honours that were completely inappropriate for someone of his social status. She appointed him as her chamberlain, which gave him unprecedented access to her private chambers, and then, just to make absolutely sure that everyone understood what was happening, she started travelling around Europe with Pergami as her constant companion. The British government was absolutely horrified. Here was the Queen of England gallivanting around the Mediterranean with the Italian servant, behaving in ways that suggested their relationship was far from professional. The British press, which had always found Caroline to be good copy, went absolutely wild with the story. But Caroline wasn't content to just have a discreet affair. Oh no, she wanted the whole world to know that she was living her best life. She and Pergami travelled to Jerusalem together in 1816, where Caroline founded the Order of St. Caroline. Yes, she created her own knightly order and made Pergami one of its first members. The ceremony was held at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, with Caroline essentially conducting a mock wedding ceremony with her lover in one of Christianity's holiest sites. The British government sent spies to document Caroline's behaviour, and their reports read like something out of a soap opera. They described Caroline and Pergami sharing a tent during their travels, bathing together on their yacht, and generally behaving in a manner wholly inconsistent with Her Majesty's position and dignity. One spy report noted that Caroline would appear on deck in the mornings wearing only a loose gown, and that Pergami would often be seen emerging from her cabin at the same time. But here's what makes Caroline's story absolutely brilliant. She knew exactly what she was doing. This wasn't just a middle-aged woman having a midlife crisis. This was a calculated campaign of public rebellion, designed to humiliate her husband and force the British government to take her seriously. When George R finally became king in 1820, he was faced with an impossible problem. He wanted to divorce Caroline, but she was technically the Queen of England, and divorcing her would require proving adultery in a very public trial. George's advisors warned him that putting Caroline on trial would create a media circus that could damage the monarchy itself. But George was so desperate to be rid of his wife that he decided to proceed anyway. The result was the trial of Queen Caroline in 1820, which became the most sensational legal proceeding of the 19th century. The House of Lords essentially put Caroline's love life on trial, calling witnesses from Italy to testify about her relationship with Pergami. The newspapers covered every detail, and the British public became completely obsessed with the proceedings. The government's case against Caroline was both detailed and utterly ridiculous. They produced witnesses who testified that Caroline and Pergami had been seen dancing together in an indecent manner, that they had shared accommodations during their travels, and that Caroline had promoted Pergami to positions far above his station. One witness claimed that Caroline had been seen kissing Pergami's hand with excessive familiarity, which apparently counted as evidence of adultery in 1820. But Caroline's defense was pure genius. Instead of denying the relationship, her lawyers argued that Caroline had been abandoned by her husband for 25 years, that George had been openly living with his own mistresses, and that Caroline had every right to seek companionship elsewhere. They essentially put George III's own behaviour on trial, and the British public loved every minute of it. The trial became a daily entertainment for people across Britain and Europe. Crowds would gather outside the House of Lords to cheer for Caroline when she arrived each day. Newspapers sold out within hours of publication. Political cartoonists had a field day creating satirical images of the proceedings. It was like the 19th century equivalent of a celebrity scandal, complete with taking sides and public demonstrations. Caroline herself became a folk hero to ordinary British people, who saw her as a woman who had been mistreated by a selfish, hypocritical husband. Crowds would chant, "Long live Queen Caroline," and "Down with King George." The government became genuinely worried that the trial was turning into a political revolution. The proceedings dragged on for months, with witness after witness describing Caroline's relationship with Pergami in excruciating detail. The British public learned more about their queen's love life than they had ever wanted to know, but they also learned that she was a woman who refused to be ignored or silenced. In the end, the government technically won the case. The House of Lords voted that Caroline had committed adultery, but the victory was so narrow and the public backlash was so intense that George IV was forced to abandon his plans for divorce. Caroline remained Queen of England in name, even though she was essentially barred from participating in any royal ceremonies. The trial had accomplished exactly what Caroline wanted. It had humiliated George IV, exposed his hypocrisy, and made her into a symbol of female independence. She had turned her scandalous love affair into a political weapon that nearly toppled the British monarchy. But Caroline's story doesn't end with her legal victory, because there's something both beautiful and tragic about a woman who spent so much energy fighting for the right to be acknowledged, only to discover that public vindication couldn't make up for decades of private loneliness. Caroline died just a year after the trial, and there are still unanswered questions about whether her death was natural or whether the stress of her public battles had taken a fatal toll. But her legacy lived on in ways that would have surprised her, because Caroline's very public rebellion helped change how the British people thought about royal marriages, personal autonomy, and the rights of women to choose their own happiness. Her story also raises fascinating questions about the royal scandals we're going to explore next. Because while Caroline fought her battles in the harsh spotlight of public attention, our next royal rebel chose a completely different strategy. She faked her own death, abandoned her empire, and disappeared into a new identity, all for a love affair so secret that historians are still debating whether it actually happened. The most elaborate disappearing act in royal history began with a funeral that nobody attended and ended with one of the most powerful women in Europe living as a peasant in the French countryside. I'm talking about Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, who in 1780 staged her own death so convincingly that 2 entire empires mourned her passing, while she was actually running away with a French cavalry officer who had convinced her to abandon everything for love. This isn't just a story about royal romance. This is about a woman who controlled the fate of 23 million people, who had spent 40 years building one of the most powerful empires in European history, and who threw it all away for a man whose name most historians still don't know. And the most incredible part? She almost got away with it. Let me paint you a picture of just how impossible this story should be. Maria Theresa wasn't just any empress. She was the ruler of the Habsburg Empire, mother to 16 children, and arguably the most powerful woman in 18th century Europe. Her empire stretched from modern-day Austria to parts of Italy, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. She had survived the War of Austrian Succession, reformed the entire imperial government, and spent decades carefully arranging marriages for her children to create a network of political alliances across the continent. This was not a woman who could just slip away for a weekend getaway. Every moment of Maria Theresa's life was scheduled, observed, and documented by dozens of courtiers, diplomats, and government officials. The idea that she could fake her own death and disappear was so preposterous that when evidence of the deception first surfaced in the 1950s, most historians assumed it was elaborate fiction. But the evidence is absolutely compelling, and it starts with something that should have been impossible, a gap in one of the most thoroughly documented lives in European history. The official story is that Maria Theresa died on November 29, 1780, at Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, surrounded by her family and closest advisors. The Empress had been ill for several weeks, and her death was attributed to complications from what her doctors called a fever of the chest. Her body was reportedly interred in the imperial crypt beneath the Capuchin church in Vienna, and the Habsburg Empire officially passed to her son, Joseph II. But here's where things get strange. The funeral was held unusually quickly, within just 3 days of the reported death. The coffin remained sealed throughout all ceremonies, with officials claiming that the Empress had requested a closed-casket funeral to preserve her dignity. Most shocking of all, several key family members and government officials were mysteriously absent from the proceedings, including 2 of Maria Theresa's daughters and her most trusted advisor, Prince von Kaunitz. The first hint that something wasn't right came from the Venetian ambassador's dispatches. Discovered in the 1960s in the Venice State Archives, Ambassador Antonio Grimani wrote to the Doge on December 2, 1780. The circumstances surrounding Her Imperial Majesty's final days have been most peculiar. I was denied the customary final audience, and several members of my staff noted unusual activity in the palace quarters that had nothing to do with preparations for mourning. Even stranger, financial records from the imperial treasury show massive withdrawals of gold and jewels in the weeks leading up to Maria Theresa's supposed death. These withdrawals were authorized by the Empress herself and labeled as special diplomatic expenses, but no corresponding diplomatic missions can be found in the official records. The mystery deepened when researchers in the 1980s discovered a series of letters in the private archives of the Marquise de Pompadour's estate in France. These letters, written in a coded cipher that wasn't broken until the 1990s, describe a secret correspondence between the French court and someone identified only as the Austrian lady, who was seeking asylum in France in exchange for political intelligence about Habsburg military plans. The letters span a period from September 1780 to March 1781, which means they were written both before and after Maria Theresa's supposed death. The most revealing letter, dated January 15, 1781, includes the line, "The Austrian lady has successfully completed her transformation and now resides quietly in our agreed location. Her former life has been buried so completely that even her own son believes her to be dead." But the most shocking evidence comes from the discovery of what historians now call the Fontainebleau woman, circus. In 1781, a mysterious woman appeared in the small French village of Fontainebleau, claiming to be the widow of a minor Austrian nobleman who had died in the recent wars. She rented a small cottage, lived simply, and was accompanied by a French cavalry officer named Captain Henri de Morville, whom she introduced as her deceased husband's friend who had promised to care for her. Local church records, preserved in the Fontainebleau Municipal Archives, describe this woman as approximately 50 years of age, of noble bearing despite her simple dress, and possessed of an unusual education for a woman of her claimed station. The parish priest noted that she spoke German, Hungarian, and Italian in addition to French, and that she seemed remarkably well informed about European political affairs for someone who claimed to be a minor widow. What makes this even more intriguing is that Captain Henri de Morville was a real person, whose military records show that he was stationed in Vienna as part of the French diplomatic mission from 1778 to 1780, exactly the period when he would have had access to the Habsburg court and the opportunity to meet Maria Theresa. The physical evidence is equally compelling. In 2003, Austrian historians gained permission to examine Maria Theresa's tomb in the imperial crypt. Using non-invasive scanning technology, they discovered that the coffin, while sealed, contained approximately the right weight for a human body, but showed unusual density patterns that suggested the presence of stones or metal objects rather than human remains. Dr. Franz Walter, the lead researcher on the project, noted, "The scans reveal density patterns consistent with a coffin filled with weighted objects designed to simulate a human body. While we cannot definitively prove that Empress Maria Theresa's body is not present, the evidence strongly suggests that the tomb contains substitute materials." The motive for such an elaborate deception becomes clear when you understand what was happening in Maria Theresa's personal life during her final years. Her husband, Emperor Francis III, had died in 1765, leaving her a widow at age 48. For 15 years, she devoted herself entirely to governing her empire and arranging advantageous marriages for her children. But by 1780, with her youngest children married and her son Joseph eager to assume full control of the government, Maria Theresa faced the prospect of becoming a ceremonial figurehead in her own empire. Contemporary accounts describe Maria Theresa as increasingly melancholy during her final years of official rule. Her personal physician, Dr. Gerard van Swieten, wrote in his private notes that the Empress frequently spoke of feeling imprisoned by the crown and expressed longing for a simple life where one might love freely without consideration of state necessities. Enter Captain Henry de Morville, who was 38 years old, devastatingly handsome according to French court records, and possessed of what one contemporary described as a romantic nature that finds beauty in simplicity rather than grandeur. Henry had been part of several diplomatic missions to Vienna, and witnesses noted that he and the Empress had developed what appeared to be a close friendship based on their shared interest in literature and philosophy. The French diplomatic archives contain several references to Henry's unusual access to the Habsburg court. The Duc de Vergennes wrote to King Louis XVI in 1779, "Captain de Morville has proven remarkably successful in cultivating relationships within the Austrian court. His friendship with certain highly placed individuals has provided valuable intelligence about Habsburg intentions. The plan they apparently devised was brilliant in its audacity. Maria Theresa would use her final illness, which may have been partially genuine but carefully exaggerated, to gradually withdraw from public appearances. A body double, likely one of her ladies-in-waiting who resembled her physically, would be prepared to take her place during the final days. The funeral would be rushed and the coffin sealed to prevent close examination, while Maria Theresa herself escaped to France using travel documents that Henri had prepared through his diplomatic connections. The Fontainebleau woman lived quietly in the French countryside for over 20 years, until her death in 1804. Local records describe her as a generous patron of the village church and a woman who was deeply devoted to Captain de Morville, whom she eventually married in a simple ceremony in 1783. Villagers remembered her as someone who would sometimes slip into German when she was emotional, and who possessed an unusual knowledge of Austrian customs and cuisine. What makes this story even more poignant is that Maria Theresa's supposed escape allowed her to experience something she had never had in her 63 years of life: the freedom to choose love over duty. The woman who had spent 4 decades arranging political marriages for her children, who had sacrificed her personal desires for the good of her empire, finally found a way to choose her own happiness. The truth may never be definitively proven, but the evidence suggests that one of history's most powerful women successfully faked her own death and lived the last 24 years of her life as a simple country woman, married to the man she loved. It would be the most romantic royal scandal in history, if only because it was the one that nobody was supposed to know about. But Maria Theresa's story raises a fascinating question about the nature of royal duty and personal freedom. If she did indeed escape her throne for love, she joins a very select group of rulers who chose personal happiness over political obligation. And that brings us to a very different kind of royal love story, one that didn't involve escape or deception, but rather a direct confrontation between European colonialism and African resistance, where love became both a weapon and a weakness in the struggle for an entire continent. Sometimes the most dangerous love affairs are the ones that cross not just royal boundaries, but entire civilizations. Let me tell you about Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Angola, whose forbidden romance with Portuguese captain João Correia de Sousa created one of the most politically explosive relationships in African history. A love story that was deliberately erased from European records because it proved that even in the brutal world of colonialism and slavery, the human heart could find connection across the deepest divides. This isn't just a story about romance. This is about how one African queen's love affair with her supposed enemy changed the entire course of Portuguese colonization in West Africa, and why European historians spent centuries trying to pretend this relationship never existed. Queen Nzinga was not your typical 17th century royal. When she assumed power in 1624, she inherited a kingdom that was being systematically destroyed by Portuguese slave traders and colonizers. Her people were being captured and shipped to Brazil as slaves. Her lands were being seized for Portuguese plantations, and the entire political structure of Central Africa was being dismantled to feed Europe's hunger for human labour. Most rulers in Nzinga's position would have either surrendered to Portuguese power or died fighting a hopeless war. Nzinga chose a third option. She would use every weapon at her disposal, including her own considerable personal magnetism, to outmaneuver, outfight, and ultimately outlast the Portuguese colonial machine. But what nobody expected, least of all Nzinga herself, was that she would fall in love with the enemy. Captain João Correia de Sousa arrived in Angola in 1627 as part of a Portuguese military expedition designed to finally crush Nzinga's resistance. João was everything that Portuguese colonial society valued: wealthy, well-connected, and completely convinced of European superiority over African savages. He had come to Angola expecting to find a primitive tribal leader who could be easily intimidated or bribed into submission. Instead, he encountered a woman who spoke fluent Portuguese, Latin, and Arabic, who had studied European military tactics and adapted them to African warfare, and who possessed a political intelligence that made most European diplomats look like amateurs. Their first meeting, during peace negotiations in 1627, was documented by Portuguese missionaries who were shocked by what they witnessed. Father Antonio de Oliveira wrote to his superiors in Lisbon, "The Queen Nzinga appeared at our negotiations dressed in European fashion, but adorned with symbols of her African authority. She spoke to Captain de Sousa in perfect Portuguese, demonstrated knowledge of European law and custom, and conducted herself with a dignity that surprised all present. Most remarkable was the evident fascination that developed between the captain and the queen during their discussions." What Father Antonio was politely describing was the moment when two brilliant, strong-willed people from completely different worlds recognized something in each other that transcended politics, race, and the brutal realities of colonial warfare. The negotiations themselves were supposed to last a few days. Instead, they stretched on for weeks, with João and Nzinga engaging in increasingly complex discussions about everything from military strategy to philosophy to religion. Portuguese records show that João began requesting private meetings with Nzinga to discuss technical details of proposed agreements, meetings that lasted for hours and seemed to involve very little actual negotiation. But here's what makes their relationship so extraordinary. It developed in the middle of active warfare. Even as João and Nzinga were falling in love, their armies were fighting battles across Angola. The cognitive dissonance must have been incredible. Imagine trying to maintain a romantic relationship with someone whose soldiers are literally trying to kill your people. The affair became an open secret among both Portuguese and African forces. Soldiers on both sides reported seeing João and Nzinga meeting in secret locations between their respective camps. African oral traditions, recorded by 20th century anthropologists, describe Nzinga as being bewitched by the Portuguese captain's unusual respect for her mind, while Portuguese colonial documents refer euphemistically to João's excessive familiarity with the native queen. What's remarkable is how their relationship influenced the actual conduct of the war. Battles during this period became strangely restrained, with both sides avoiding the kind of total warfare that had characterized earlier conflicts. Military historians have noted that casualties dropped significantly during the months when João and Nzinga were conducting their affair, suggesting that both leaders were deliberately avoiding actions that might harm their lovers' people. The Portuguese colonial administration was horrified. Here was one of their military commanders conducting what was essentially a romantic relationship with the leader of the African resistance. Governor Fernão de Sousa wrote to Lisbon in 1628, "Captain de Sousa's conduct has become a scandal that threatens our entire colonial enterprise. His evident sympathy for the rebel queen has corrupted his judgment and endangered our military objectives." But João's corruption had actually given the Portuguese unprecedented insight into Nzinga's strategies and motivations. Through their relationship, he learned that Nzinga's resistance wasn't based on simple hostility to Europeans, but on a sophisticated understanding of how Portuguese colonialism would destroy African society. She wasn't fighting against European civilization. She was fighting for the right of African civilizations to exist alongside European ones. This understanding changed João in ways that terrified his superiors. He began questioning the morality of the slave trade, advocating for negotiated settlements rather than military conquest, and arguing that Nzinga should be treated as a legitimate sovereign rather than a rebel leader. In other words, falling in love with Nzinga had turned João into exactly the kind of Portuguese colonial that the empire couldn't afford to have. The crisis came to a head in 1629 when João was officially recalled to Lisbon, but instead of obeying orders, he deserted his command and fled to Nzinga's capital, where he essentially defected to the African side. For a Portuguese military officer to abandon his post and join an African queen was unprecedented in colonial history. It was like a Confederate general defecting to the Union, except with even higher racial and political stakes. João's defection created a massive scandal in Portuguese colonial society. The idea that a white European could choose African loyalty over Portuguese patriotism challenged fundamental assumptions about racial superiority and colonial authority. If Portuguese officers could be corrupted by relationships with African leaders, how could the empire maintain control over its African colonies? The Portuguese response was swift and brutal. They declared João a traitor and placed a bounty on his head. They launched a massive military campaign against Nzinga, designed not just to defeat her resistance, but to punish her for corrupting a Portuguese officer. And they began a systematic campaign to erase any evidence of the relationship from official records. This is why João and Nzinga's love story disappeared from European histories for over 300 years. Portuguese colonial administrators literally rewrote the records to eliminate references to their affair, because the relationship challenged too many fundamental assumptions about European-African relations. The idea that a Portuguese captain could genuinely love and respect an African queen was so threatening to colonial ideology that it had to be erased from history. But the African side of the story survived in oral traditions and local chronicles. These sources describe João as becoming one of Nzinga's most trusted military advisors, helping her develop new strategies for resisting Portuguese conquest. They also describe their relationship as one of genuine partnership. Two brilliant leaders who had found in each other not just romantic love, but intellectual and political collaboration. The military consequences of their partnership were immediately apparent. With Joan's knowledge of Portuguese tactics and Nzinga's understanding of African terrain and culture, the resistance movement became far more effective. The Portuguese found themselves fighting an enemy who seemed to anticipate their every move, who had adopted European military technology while retaining African strategic advantages. Their personal relationship also produced what may have been the most politically significant child in 17th century Africa. African sources describe a son born to Nzinga and João around 1630, a child who would have been both African royalty and the descendant of Portuguese nobility. This boy, if he existed, would have represented the possibility of a truly Afro-European political alliance based on equality rather than domination. Portuguese records make no mention of this child, which is exactly what you'd expect if colonial authorities were trying to erase evidence of the relationship. But African oral traditions describe a young man who grew up to become one of Nzinga's most effective military commanders, someone who could move between African and European worlds with equal ease. The love story ended tragically, as most stories of this kind do. João was killed in battle in 1635, fighting alongside Nzinga against a Portuguese army that included many of his former comrades. His death devastated Nzinga, but it also freed her to pursue a more aggressive military strategy without worrying about endangering her lover. What happened next proved just how much João's influence had changed Nzinga's approach to colonial resistance. Instead of simply fighting Portuguese expansion, she began building alliances with other African kingdoms, creating a confederation of resistance that kept the Portuguese confined to coastal areas for decades. She also began diplomatic outreach to other European powers, particularly the Dutch, playing European rivalries against each other in ways that would have impressed Machiavelli. Nzinga's ultimate success, she remained undefeated until her death in 1663, was partly due to military strategies she'd learned from her relationship with João. But more importantly, her love affair with a Portuguese captain had taught her something crucial about European psychology. Europeans weren't an alien, incomprehensible enemy. They were human beings with their own internal conflicts, contradictions, and capacity for change. This understanding made Nzinga one of the most effective anti-colonial leaders in African history. She had learned to fight Europeans not as an outsider who didn't understand their culture, but as someone who had loved one of them deeply enough to see both their strengths and their weaknesses. The fact that this incredible love story was deliberately erased from European historical records tells us something important about how colonial powers used historical narrative to justify their actions. A love story between equals couldn't be allowed to exist in the official record, because it would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of the European colonialism. But while Nzinga and João's affair was hidden from history, our next royal scandal was impossible to conceal, because when Austria-Hungary's Crown Prince Rudolph decided to die for love, he chose to do it in the most public, most politically explosive way imaginable, creating a mystery that would haunt the Habsburg Empire until its very end. When love becomes a death pact, the consequences can topple empires. On January 30th, 1889, Crown Prince Rudolph of Austria-Hungary and his 17-year-old lover, Baroness Mary Vetsera, were found dead in a hunting lodge at Mayerling. The official story was suicide, but the evidence suggests something far more sinister, a cover-up that reached the highest levels of European government and involved murder, political conspiracy, and secrets so explosive that they're still classified over 130 years later. This isn't just the story of a tragic royal romance, This is about how two young people's forbidden love became entangled in international espionage, revolutionary politics, and a web of court intrigue so complex that their deaths may have been orchestrated to prevent the complete collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Let me start with something that should have been impossible. How do two people commit suicide together when only one gun was found at the scene? And why were there signs of a struggle in a room where two lovers supposedly died peacefully in each other's arms? Crown Prince Rudolph was not your typical Habsburg heir. At 30 years old, he was brilliant, progressive, and absolutely miserable in his role as future emperor. Rudolph believed in democracy, supported Hungarian independence, and privately advocated for policies that would have dismantled the very empire he was supposed to inherit. In other words, he was everything that the conservative Habsburg establishment feared in a future ruler, but Rudolph's political views were just one part of a much larger problem. He was also conducting secret negotiations with French intelligence agents, writing anonymous articles for liberal newspapers, and carrying on multiple affairs that scandalized the imperial court. The man who was supposed to represent the stability and continuity of the Habsburg dynasty was actually working to undermine everything his family stood for. Enter Baroness Mary Vetsera, a 17-year-old girl from a wealthy but politically insignificant family who became obsessed with Crown Prince Rudolph in the most dangerous way possible. Mary wasn't just infatuated with Rudolph's royal status, she was fascinated by his revolutionary ideas and his vision of a completely different kind of Europe. Their affair began in late 1888, and from the very beginning. It was unlike Rudolph's previous relationships. Mary wasn't a sophisticated court lady or an experienced mistress who understood the rules of royal discretion. She was a teenager who was completely, recklessly in love, and she didn't care who knew about it. The problem was that Mary's indiscretion came at exactly the wrong time. Rudolph was under intense surveillance by both Austrian secret police and foreign intelligence services who suspected him of treasonous activities. His communications were being intercepted, his movements were being tracked, and his relationships were being analyzed for potential security threats. When Austrian intelligence discovered that Rudolph was having an affair with Mary Vetsera, they didn't just see a royal scandal, they saw a potential disaster. Because Mary's family had connections to French and Russian diplomatic circles, and Rudolph was already suspected of passing state secrets to foreign agents, the surveillance reports from the Austrian state police, declassified in the 1980s, reveal the extent to which Rudolph and Mary's relationship was being monitored. Detective Inspector Franz von Krauss wrote in his final report, "The Crown Prince's association with Baroness Vetsera has created security vulnerabilities that extend far beyond matters of personal discretion. The Baroness's family connections and the Prince's known political sympathies suggest possibilities for foreign manipulation that pose direct threats to state security." But the real crisis began when Rudolph decided to use his relationship with Mary as cover for increasingly dangerous political activities. In January 1889, just days before their deaths, Rudolph met secretly with representatives of Hungarian revolutionary movements who were planning an uprising against Austrian rule. The meeting was arranged through Mary's contacts, and she was present during at least part of the discussions. This is where the official story of a romantic suicide pact begins to fall apart, because if Rudolph and Mary were simply star-crossed lovers who decided to die together, why were there Hungarian revolutionaries at Mayerling in the days before their deaths? And why did several of these revolutionaries also die under mysterious circumstances in the weeks following the incident? The physical evidence from the death scene has never made sense. Rudolph was found shot in the head, but the angle of the wound suggested that he couldn't have fired the gun himself. Mary was found poisoned, but there was no suicide note in her handwriting, and the poison used was a rare compound that wasn't readily available to civilians. Most tellingly, the room showed clear signs of a struggle. Furniture was overturned. There were blood stains in locations that didn't correspond to where the bodies were found, and several items were missing from the scene, including Rudolph's personal papers and a locked briefcase that witnesses had seen him carrying to mailing. Dr. Edward Hoffman, the physician who performed the initial examination of the bodies, wrote in his private notes, "The physical evidence suggests that both victims were murdered by persons unknown. However, I have been instructed by the highest authorities to certify this as a case of suicide, and I dare not contradict such instructions." The cover-up began immediately and involved the highest levels of the Habsburg government. Emperor Franz Joseph personally ordered that all evidence from the scene be confiscated and sealed. The official investigation was conducted in secret, with no independent witnesses allowed to examine the bodies or the crime scene. Mary Vetsera's body was secretly removed from mailing in the middle of the night and buried in an unmarked grave, with her family forbidden from holding a funeral or even acknowledging her death publicly. Rudolph's body was prepared for a state funeral, but the imperial physicians who examined him were sworn to secrecy about their findings. The most shocking evidence of a cover-up comes from recently discovered correspondence between Emperor Franz Joseph and Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany. In a letter dated February 15, 1889, Franz Joseph wrote, "The resolution of the Meiling incident has required measures that go beyond normal legal procedures. The security of our respective empires demanded that certain facts remain concealed from public knowledge." Kaiser Wilhelm's response, found in the German Foreign Ministry archives in 1995, is even more revealing. "Your handling of the Rudolph situation has been both necessary and wise. The revolutionary connections that were discovered could have destabilized our entire region. Sometimes the death of two people prevents the deaths of thousands." What emerges from the evidence is a picture of Rudolph and Mary as victims of an assassination designed to look like a suicide pact. Rudolph's revolutionary activities had made him too dangerous to remain alive, but simply executing the crown prince would have created a political crisis that could have destroyed the Habsburg Empire. The solution was brilliantly Machiavellian. Eliminate Rudolph while making it appear that he had chosen death over the shame of a scandalous love affair. This narrative served multiple purposes. It removed a political threat, discredited Rudolph's revolutionary ideas by making him appear mentally unstable, and provided a romantic explanation that distracted from the political implications of his death. Mary Vetsera was the perfect cover story. Her genuine love for Rudolph made the suicide pact narrative believable, while her youth and relative insignificance meant that her death would be seen as tragic but not politically important. She became collateral damage in a political assassination disguised as a crime of passion. The immediate beneficiary of Rudolph's death was Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who became the new heir to the Habsburg throne. Franz Ferdinand was far more conservative than Rudolph, and had no interest in revolutionary politics or democratic reforms. His succession ensured that the Habsburg Empire would continue unchanged, at least for another 25 years, but the long-term consequences of the mailing incident were devastating for the Habsburg dynasty. Rudolph's death eliminated the most capable and charismatic member of the royal family, leaving the empire to be inherited by Franz Ferdinand, whose assassination in Sarajevo in 1914 would trigger World War I and ultimately destroy the empire that Rudolph's murder had been designed to preserve. The personal cost of the cover-up was enormous. Mary Vetsera's family was destroyed by the scandal and the enforced silence about their daughter's death. Rudolph's wife, Crown Princess Stephanie, spent the rest of her life knowing that her husband had been murdered but being unable to speak about it publicly. Even Emperor Franz Joseph seemed haunted by his decision to cover up his son's assassination, becoming increasingly isolated and melancholy in his final years. The mailing incident also established a template for how European governments would handle inconvenient royal scandals in the future. The combination of state secrecy, media manipulation, and official lies that was used to conceal Rudolph's murder would be refined and perfected by later royal houses facing their own political crises. What makes Rudolph and Mary's story so tragic is that their genuine love for each other was used as a weapon against them. Their affair provided the perfect cover for a political assassination, and their deaths were transformed into a romantic tragedy that obscured the real reasons they had to die. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the mailing incident is how successfully the cover-up worked. For over a century, most people accepted the official story of a suicide pact, and even today, many historians remain reluctant to acknowledge the evidence for assassination. The power of a good love story to distract from political murder is apparently as strong today as it was in 1889. While the mailing incident shows us how royal love affairs can be used to conceal political crimes, our next story reveals an even more complex relationship between romance, power, and conspiracy. Because when the last Tsarina of Russia fell under the influence of a mysterious holy man, their relationship would become the scandal that finally brought down the Romanov dynasty and changed the course of world history. The most dangerous man in Russian history wasn't a general, a revolutionary, or a politician. He was a peasant from Siberia who convinced the Tsarina that he could save her son's life, and whose mysterious relationship with Empress Alexandra became the scandal that finally destroyed the Romanov dynasty. But here's what most people don't know about Grigory Rasputin. The real story of his influence over the Russian royal family is far stranger, far more intimate, and far more politically explosive than the myths that have surrounded him for over a century. This isn't just about a holy man who gained too much power. This is about a relationship so intense, so psychologically complex, and so sexually charged that it convinced an entire empire that their Tsarina was betraying Russia itself. And the evidence suggests that the rumours about Rasputin and Alexandra may have been closer to the truth than anyone wanted to admit. Let me start with a fact that will change everything you think you know about this story. Rasputin didn't seduce the Tsarina with religious mysticism or magical healing powers. He seduced her with something far more potent and far more dangerous. He gave her hope when the best doctors in Europe had told her that her son was going to die. The Tsarevich Alexei suffered from haemophilia, a genetic blood disorder that meant any injury, however minor, could cause internal bleeding that would kill him. In the early 1900s, there was no treatment for this condition. Alexandra had already watched her son nearly die multiple times, and the royal physicians had essentially told her to prepare for the inevitable. Into this nightmare stepped Grigory Rasputin, a man who claimed that God had given him the power to heal the sick and save the dying. And here's the thing that nobody wants to acknowledge. Rasputin actually could help Alexei, whether through hypnosis, psychological manipulation, or some form of medical knowledge that he never revealed. Rasputin had the ability to stop the boy's bleeding episodes when conventional medicine failed. This wasn't religious superstition. This was a desperate mother clinging to the only person who seemed able to keep her child alive. But the price Alexandra paid for Rasputin's help would ultimately cost her family their throne and their lives. The relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin began in 1905, when the Tsarina was introduced to him by friends who believed he might be able to help with Alexei's condition. The first documented healing occurred during a particularly severe bleeding episode when Alexei was near death. The court physicians had given up hope, but Rasputin spent several hours alone with the child, and by morning, the bleeding had stopped and Alexei's fever had broken. From that moment, Alexandra became completely dependent on Rasputin in ways that went far beyond his role as a healer. The French ambassador Maurice Paléologue wrote in his memoirs, "The Empress speaks of Rasputin with a mystical exultation that troubles all who hear her. She attributes to him not only the power to heal her son, but an almost divine insight into matters of state and personal guidance." But here's where the story gets really complicated. Rasputin wasn't content to simply heal the Tsarevich. He began inserting himself into every aspect of Alexandra's life, offering advice on everything from government appointments to military strategy, and Alexandra, grateful for his help with Alexei and increasingly isolated from Russian society, began treating Rasputin's opinions as if they came directly from God. The letters between Alexandra and Rasputin, discovered in the Soviet archives in the 1970s, reveal a relationship of extraordinary intimacy and psychological dependency. Alexandra wrote to Rasputin, "My beloved, unforgettable teacher, redeemer and mentor, I kiss your hands and lean my head against your blessed shoulder. I feel so joyful when you are near. I only wish one thing, to fall asleep forever on your shoulder and in your arms." That's not the language of a purely spiritual relationship. That's the language of a woman who has become emotionally and possibly physically obsessed with the man she believes saved her child's life. Rasputin's own letters to Alexandra are even more revealing. In one message from 1915 he wrote, "My precious Mama, your son will live and you will find peace. Come to me before making any important decisions, and I will guide you as our Lord guides me. You belong to me as I belong to you, in ways that others cannot understand." The Russian court was horrified by the obvious intimacy between the Tsarina and this peasant mystic. Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich wrote to Tsar Nicholas, "The Empress has fallen under the complete influence of a man whose reputation is so scandalous that his very presence at court has become a source of the most damaging rumours about the imperial family." But the rumours were about to get much worse, because Rasputin's influence over Alexandra began affecting Russian government policy in ways that seemed designed to benefit Germany during World War I. Alexandra was German-born, which already made her suspect in the eyes of many Russians. When she began advocating for policies that Rasputin recommended, policies that often seemed to favour German interests, the rumours evolved from personal scandal to accusations of treason. The most damaging incident occurred in 1915 when Alexandra convinced Nicholas to dismiss several competent military commanders and replace them with men who had no qualifications other than Rasputin's approval. One of these appointments, General Alexei Brusilov wrote in his memoirs, seemed designed to ensure Russian military failure rather than success. By 1916, the relationship between Alexandra and Rasputin had become so notorious that political leaders across Europe were discussing it in official correspondence. British Foreign Secretary Edward Grey wrote to the British ambassador in Russia, "The influence which this peasant exercises over the Russian Empress has become a matter of international concern, as it appears to be affecting Russian military decision-making in ways that benefit our enemies." But the most explosive evidence of the true nature of Alexandra and Rasputin's relationship comes from the testimony of Anna Virubova, Alexandra's closest friend and confidant. In interviews conducted in the 1920s, after she'd fled Russia, Virubova described witnessing private meetings between Alexandra and Rasputin that were clearly not purely spiritual in nature. According to Virubova, she once entered Alexandra's private chambers unexpectedly and found the Tsarina and Rasputin in what she diplomatically described as a state of intimate conversation and physical proximity that would have been scandalous if observed by others. Virubova claimed that Alexandra made her swear never to speak of what she had seen, saying that certain relationships transcend conventional understanding and serve higher purposes. The political consequences of these rumours were catastrophic for the Romanov dynasty. By 1916, even loyal supporters of the monarchy were convinced that the Tsarina was either having an affair with Rasputin or had fallen so completely under his influence that she was essentially allowing a peasant mystic to run the Russian Empire. Conservative politician Vladimir Purishkevich declared in the Duma, "The dark forces that surround our emperor and especially our empress have turned our government into a laughingstock. When a German woman and a Siberian peasant can determine Russian policy, we're no longer an empire, we're a tragedy." The crisis reached its peak in December 1916, when a group of Russian nobles, led by Prince Felix Yusupov, decided that Rasputin had to be eliminated to save the monarchy. The assassination plot was elaborate and desperate. They lured Rasputin to Yusupov's palace with the promise of meeting Yusupov's wife, then poisoned, shot, and finally drowned him in the Neva River. But killing Rasputin didn't solve the fundamental problem. Alexandra's reputation had been so thoroughly destroyed by her association with him that no amount of political reform could restore public confidence in the monarchy. When revolution came in 1917, one of the primary charges against the royal family was that Alexandra had allowed Rasputin to corrupt the government and betray Russian interests to Germany. The tragedy is that Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin, whatever its true nature, began with the most understandable of motivations, a mother's desperate desire to save her dying child. But it evolved into something that destroyed not just her personal reputation, but the entire political foundation of the Russian monarchy. Modern historians who have studied the evidence suggest that Alexandra and Rasputin's relationship was probably not a conventional sexual affair, but rather a form of psychological and emotional dependency that was in some ways even more intense than a purely physical relationship. Alexandra had become so psychologically dependent on Rasputin that she literally could not function without his approval and guidance. This dependency was exploited not just by Rasputin himself, but by various political factions who used his influence over Alexandra to manipulate government policy for their own purposes. The man who claimed to be saving Russia was actually being used as a tool to destroy it from within. The ultimate irony is that Rasputin's murder, which was supposed to save the monarchy, actually accelerated its collapse. Without Rasputin to blame for their problems, the Russian people turned their anger directly toward Nicholas and Alexandra themselves. The revolution that began just 3 months after Rasputin's death would ultimately cost the entire Romanov family their lives. Alexandra's story reveals how the most personal, most intimate relationships can become weapons in political warfare. Her love for her son and her dependency on the man who seemed able to save him became the scandal that brought down an empire that had ruled Russia for over 300 years. But while Alexandra's relationship with Rasputin destroyed a dynasty that had ruled for centuries, our next royal scandal involves a more modern tragedy, a queen who sacrificed an ancient throne for Hollywood dreams, and whose choice between crown and camera created a revolution that changed the Middle East forever. In 1958, something unprecedented happened in the history of monarchy. A queen literally walked away from 2,500 years of Persian imperial tradition to pursue a career in Hollywood. Queen Soraya of Iran didn't just abandon her throne for love, she abandoned it for fame, fortune, and a passionate affair with Italian film director Franco Indovina that scandalized the entire Middle East and helped trigger the revolution that would eventually topple the Shah himself. This is the story of a woman who looked at being empress of one of the world's oldest monarchies and said, "Actually, I'd rather be a movie star." And the most incredible part, she almost pulled it off. Soraya Esfandiari Bakhtiari became Queen of Iran in 1951 when she married Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in what was supposed to be the fairy tale wedding of the century. She was 19 years old, stunningly beautiful, and came from one of Iran's most prominent noble families. The Shah was 32, recently divorced, and desperately in need of a wife who could give him the male heir that would secure the Pahlavi dynasty. For 7 years, their marriage was the envy of international society. Soraya was featured on the covers of fashion magazines. She entertained world leaders, and she became the glamorous face of Iran's modernization under the Shah's rule. But there was one devastating problem. Despite years of trying, Soraya couldn't get pregnant. In most monarchies, this would have been a private tragedy. But in Iran, where the Shah was trying to establish a new dynasty and modernize an ancient country, the lack of an heir became a political crisis. Conservative religious leaders began whispering that God was displeased with the Pahlavi rule. Political rivals started suggesting that maybe the Shah needed a new wife, and the international community began questioning whether the Shah's modernization program could survive without dynastic continuity. The pressure on Soraya was enormous. She underwent every medical treatment available in the 1950s, consulted specialists in Switzerland, France, and America, and endured years of invasive procedures that left her physically and emotionally exhausted. Palace insiders described her as becoming increasingly isolated and melancholy as the years passed without a pregnancy. But instead of becoming a tragic figure, Soraya made a choice that shocked everyone who knew her. In 1958, rather than accept being quietly divorced and replaced by a more fertile wife, she negotiated something that no royal woman had ever achieved: a divorce settlement that gave her complete financial independence and the freedom to pursue any career she wanted. The divorce agreement, discovered in the Shah's personal papers after the 1979 revolution, reveals just how desperate the Iranian royal family was to avoid a public scandal. Soraya received a settlement worth over $20 million in today's money, plus annual payments that would continue for life, plus the right to keep her royal jewellery and maintain residences in Europe. In exchange, she agreed to leave Iran quietly and never publicly criticize the Shah or the Iranian monarchy. Most divorced queens would have retired to a quiet life of charitable work and social activities. Soraya had different ideas. Within 6 months of her divorce, she had moved to Rome and announced her intention to become a film actress. The international media went absolutely wild. Here was a woman who had been the Empress of Iran, a country with oil wealth, strategic importance, and a 2,500-year-old royal tradition, and she was giving it all up to audition for movies. It was like watching someone trade a Rolls-Royce for a lottery ticket, except the lottery ticket might actually pay off. Soraya's entry into the film world was orchestrated by one of the most powerful men in Italian cinema, Franco Indovina. Franco was everything that the Shah wasn't: artistic, bohemian, and completely uninterested in political power. He was also married, which made their relationship even more scandalous. Franco saw in Soraya something that went beyond her obvious beauty and royal connections. He saw a woman who had the sophistication to move in international society, the intelligence to understand complex characters, and the emotional depth that came from personal tragedy. In other words, he saw movie star potential in a package that no marketing department could have invented. Their affair began as a professional collaboration and quickly became something much more intense. Soraya later wrote in her memoirs, "Franco understood that I needed to create a new identity for myself, someone who was more than just a failed queen. With him, I discovered that I could be an artist, a creator, someone who existed for reasons that had nothing to do with royal bloodlines or political necessity. The film they made together. The Three Faces of a Woman was released in 1965 and featured Soraya in 3 different roles that seemed to mirror her own life: a naive young woman, a sophisticated socialite, and a woman searching for her true identity. The movie was a critical success in Europe and established Soraya as a legitimate actress rather than just a curiosity. But Soraya's Hollywood dreams had consequences that went far beyond her personal life. Her very public rejection of royal duty and Persian tradition became a symbol for Iranian women who were chafing under traditional restrictions. If the former Queen of Iran could choose career over marriage, independence over security, then maybe other Iranian women could make similar choices. The Shah was furious. Internal documents from the Iranian Foreign Ministry, released after the revolution, show that he spent enormous resources trying to discourage international media coverage of Soraya's film career. He was particularly incensed by interviews where Soraya spoke about the suffocating restrictions of royal life and her joy at being able to finally live as a free woman. Conservative Iranian clerics were even more outraged. Ayatollah Khomeini, who would later lead the 1979 revolution, specifically cited Soraya's behavior as an example of how Western influence was corrupting Iranian values. In a 1967 sermon, he declared, "When a woman who was honored to be the wife of our Shah chooses the degradation of acting in foreign films over the dignity of Iranian motherhood, we see the corruption that Western ideas bring to our sacred traditions." Soraya's response to these criticisms was typically defiant. In a 1968 interview with Paris Match, she said, "I refuse to apologize for choosing a life of creativity and independence over a life of silent suffering. If this makes me a bad Iranian woman, then perhaps the definition of a good Iranian woman needs to change." Her film career continued throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, with roles in both European art films and international productions. She never became a major Hollywood star, but she achieved something arguably more significant. She became a symbol of what was possible for women who were willing to reject traditional expectations and create their own definitions of success. The political impact of Soraya's choices extended far beyond Iran. Her story inspired women throughout the Middle East who were questioning traditional gender roles. She proved that a woman could walk away from the ultimate position of female privilege, being a queen, and still create a meaningful, independent life. But Soraya's story also had a dark side that reveals the real cost of her choices. Her relationship with Franco Indovina ended tragically in 1972 when he died in a plane crash. The love affair that had given her the courage to leave her throne and pursue her dreams was suddenly gone, leaving her alone in a world that still saw her primarily as a former queen, rather than an accomplished woman in her own right. The letters Soraya wrote to friends after Franco's death, discovered in her personal papers after her own death in 2001, reveal a woman who was struggling with the question of whether her choices had been worth the price she paid. She wrote to her close friend Princess Grace of Monaco, "I wonder sometimes if I traded the certainty of unhappiness for the uncertainty of happiness, and whether that was wise. But I cannot imagine living the life I was expected to live, even knowing the pain that my choices have brought." Soraya's story became even more poignant in 1979 when the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah and ended the Pahlavi dynasty. The very monarchy that she had abandoned for love and independence was destroyed by the same social forces that her choices had helped to unleash. Iranian women who'd been inspired by her example were among the most active participants in the revolution, though, ironically, Many of them would find their freedoms even more restricted under the Islamic Republic that followed. The cruel irony is that Soraya's decision to leave her throne may have been both personally liberating and politically prophetic. She saw before almost anyone else that the traditional structures of power in Iran were unsustainable, and that the rigid gender roles that had confined her as queen were becoming impossible to maintain in a modernizing society. By choosing Hollywood over the throne, Soraya demonstrated that even the most privileged position in traditional society, being a queen, was no longer enough to satisfy the aspirations of modern women. Her choice to leave the throne for the silver screen was really a choice between the past and the future, between tradition and transformation. In the end, Soraya got exactly what she wanted: a life on her own terms, independent of political necessity and traditional expectations, but she also discovered something that many people who achieve their dreams learn. Getting what you want doesn't always bring the happiness you expected it would. Her story raises questions that are still relevant today about the relationship between personal fulfillment and social responsibility, between individual choice and collective tradition. Can someone in a position of enormous privilege and responsibility simply walk away when the role becomes personally unsatisfying? And what happens to the institutions and traditions that depend on people staying in roles they no longer want to play? But while Soraya's story shows us a queen who chose fame over duty, our next tale reveals an even more dramatic rejection of traditional power. Because some royal women didn't just abandon their thrones, they literally rewrote the entire concept of what it meant to rule an empire. And when I tell you about the concubine who became China's only female emperor, you'll understand that sometimes the most forbidden love affair is the one between a woman and absolute power itself. Imagine being so ruthlessly ambitious that you seduce 3 emperors, eliminate your own children when they threaten your power, and literally rewrite 2,000 years of Chinese tradition to become the only woman in history to rule the Middle Kingdom as emperor in her own right. Meet Zetian, whose rise from teenage concubine to absolute ruler involved love affairs so strategically calculated and murders so brilliantly executed that she makes every other royal schemer in history look like an amateur. This isn't just the story of a woman who broke the ultimate glass ceiling. This is about someone who understood that in a world where women were property, the only way to survive was to own everything, including the men who thought they owned her. Wu Zetian's story begins in 636 AD when she entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a 14-year-old concubine. In the Chinese imperial system, concubines were essentially beautiful decorations, ranked in a complex hierarchy and valued primarily for their ability to provide male heirs. Most concubines lived and died in obscurity, forgotten footnotes in the stories of the men they served. Wu had different plans. From the moment she entered the Forbidden City, she was studying the political system like a master's degree in palace intrigue. She learned who held real power versus who had impressive titles, which alliances were stable and which were vulnerable, and most importantly, how to make herself indispensable to people who could either elevate or destroy her. But here's what makes Wu's story so extraordinary. She didn't just seduce her way to power, she proved herself intellectually superior to almost everyone around her. Emperor Taizong, who was known for his intelligence and political sophistication, began consulting Wu on matters of state. Contemporary records show that she became one of his most trusted advisors, helping to draft imperial edicts and participating in high-level political discussions. The Tang dynasty histories, compiled centuries later, describe Wu as possessing an understanding of statecraft that surpassed many of the emperor's male advisors. This wasn't just pillow talk. This was a teenager demonstrating that she understood complex political and economic issues better than men who had spent their entire careers in government service. When Emperor Taizong died in 649, Wu should have been sent to a Buddhist convent to live out her days in religious seclusion, which was the traditional fate of imperial concubines whose emperors had died. Instead, she managed to catch the attention of the new emperor, Gaozong, who was technically her stepson according to Chinese court hierarchy. The relationship between Wu and Gaozong was forbidden on multiple levels. She had been his father's concubine, making their relationship technically incestuous by Chinese standards. She was significantly older than the young emperor and far more politically experienced. Most scandalously, she was the one pursuing him, rather than passively waiting to be chosen. Wu's seduction of Gaozong was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. She positioned herself not as a beautiful woman seeking protection, but as a political ally who could help him consolidate power against rivals at court. She demonstrated her value by providing him with intelligence about potential conspiracies and helping him outmaneuver older, more established political factions. The strategy worked perfectly. In 652, Gaozong made Wu his concubine, and by 655 he had elevated her to the position of empress, displacing his existing wife in a move that shocked the entire Chinese political establishment. But Wu's elevation to empress was just the beginning of her systematic takeover of the Chinese government. What happened next reveals the true scope of Wu's ambition and the lengths she was willing to go to secure her position. Chinese historical records, particularly the New Book of Tang, describe a series of mysterious deaths and political purges that systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to Wu's growing power. Her most shocking alleged crime was the murder of her own infant daughter in 654. According to court historians, Wu strangled the baby and then accused Empress Wang, Gaozong's first wife, of the murder. The accusation led to Wang's execution and cleared the way for Wu's elevation to empress. Whether this story is true or simply propaganda written by Wu's later enemies, it demonstrates the level of ruthlessness that people believed she possessed. But Wu's real genius wasn't in individual murders. It was in her systematic destruction of the traditional Chinese political system and its replacement with a government that answered directly to her. She convinced Gaozong to purge the old aristocratic families that had dominated Chinese politics for centuries, replacing them with officials who owed their positions entirely to imperial favor. This wasn't just political maneuvering. This was a complete revolution in how Chinese government operated. Wu essentially destroyed the hereditary aristocracy and replaced it with a meritocracy, where advancement depended on ability and loyalty rather than birth. It was one of the most progressive governmental reforms in world history, and it was implemented by a woman who wasn't even supposed to have political opinions. As Gaozong's health declined in the 60s and 70s, Wu gradually assumed more and more governmental responsibilities. She started by handling routine administrative matters, then began making policy decisions, and eventually was essentially running the empire while Gaozong served as a ceremonial figurehead. The Chinese court was horrified by this development, but they were powerless to stop it. Wu had spent decades building a network of officials who owed their careers to her patronage. She controlled the secret police, the military promotions, and the imperial treasury. Any attempt to challenge her authority would have meant challenging the entire governmental structure that she had created. When Gaozong died in 683, Wu faced the ultimate test of her power. According to Chinese tradition, the empire should have passed to Gaozong's eldest son, with Wu serving as a powerless dowager empress. Instead, Wu placed her younger, more malleable son on the throne and continued to rule as the power behind the throne. But even this wasn't enough for Wu's ambitions. In 690, she did something that was literally unprecedented in Chinese history. She deposed her own son and declared herself emperor, not empress, but emperor, using the masculine title that implied absolute authority over the Middle Kingdom. The audacity of this move cannot be overstated. For over 2,000 years, Chinese political theory had held that the emperor ruled with the mandate of heaven, a divine authorization that could only be given to men. Wu's claim to be emperor wasn't just political rebellion. It was a direct challenge to the cosmic order that Chinese civilization was built upon. To justify her unprecedented position, Wu created an entirely new religious and political ideology. She promoted Buddhism over Confucianism because Buddhist texts contained examples of powerful female religious figures. She commissioned scholars to write treatises proving that women could receive the mandate of heaven. She even changed the Chinese calendar and created new imperial symbols that emphasized feminine power rather than masculine authority. Wu's reign as emperor lasted from 690 to 705, and by almost any measure, it was remarkably successful. She expanded Chinese territory, promoted economic development, and maintained internal stability during a period when most empires were struggling with succession crises and foreign invasions. The Chinese economy grew, the arts flourished, and the governmental reforms she had implemented created a more efficient and less corrupt administration. But Wu's personal life during her reign as emperor was just as scandalous as her political career. At an age when most women were grandmothers focused on religious contemplation, Wu was conducting affairs with men young enough to be her grandsons. Her relationship with the Zhang brothers, two young men who served as her personal attendants, created rumors that the female emperor was as sexually voracious as any male ruler. The Tang dynasty histories describe Wu's court as a place where traditional gender roles were completely inverted. Men competed for the emperor's sexual attention in ways that had previously been associated only with women. Female officials held positions of real power, while male courtiers served primarily decorative functions. It was like an alternative universe where women ruled and men were ornamental. Wu's love affairs during her reign weren't just personal indulgences, they were political statements. By publicly taking young male lovers, she was demonstrating that she possessed all the privileges traditionally associated with male emperors, including the right to sexual autonomy and multiple partners. She was literally rewriting the rules of imperial sexuality along with everything else. But Wu's greatest achievement may have been her systematic elevation of women throughout Chinese society. During her reign, women could inherit property, serve in government positions, and receive formal education in unprecedented numbers. She created a governmental examination system that, for the first and only time in Chinese history, was open to qualified women as well as men. The social revolution that Wu initiated was so complete that it took centuries for later dynasties to fully reverse her reforms, even after her death and the restoration of male rule. Chinese women retained many of the rights and opportunities that Wu had created for them. Wu's reign ended in 705 when she was forced to abdicate in favor of her son, but even her departure from power was on her own terms. She negotiated a peaceful transition that preserved her personal safety and maintained the governmental reforms that she had spent decades implementing. What makes Wu Zetian's story so remarkable is that she succeeded in completely redefining what was possible for women in one of the world's most traditional societies. She proved that female rule wasn't just theoretically possible, it could be more effective and more progressive than the male-dominated systems it replaced. Her love affairs, her political manipulations, and her revolutionary reforms were all part of a single grand strategy: the complete transformation of Chinese society from a male-dominated aristocracy to a meritocracy where power belonged to whoever was intelligent and ruthless enough to seize it. But while Zetian conquered an entire empire through calculated romance and political genius, our next story takes us to a very different kind of royal rebellion, one that happened not in ancient China, but in the palaces of modern Europe, where a Habsburg princess decided that aristocratic protocol was far less interesting than running away to join the circus. Picture this. In 1925, one of Europe's most prestigious princesses literally ran away from her palace to join the circus. And I'm not talking about some metaphorical rebellion. Princess Stephanie of Habsburg-Lorraine actually packed her jewels, abandoned her royal duties, and fell madly in love with Giovanni Torriani, an Italian elephant trainer whose only claim to nobility was his ability to make a 5,000-pound elephant dance to Puccini. Their scandalous romance created the first modern royal media circus and changed forever how the world thought about aristocracy, entertainment, and the increasingly blurry line between the two. This is the story of blue blood meeting sawdust, of ancient privilege colliding with populist entertainment, and of a woman who discovered that sometimes the most authentic life is the one that looks completely fake to everyone else. Princess Stephanie Marie Wilhelmina was born into the Habsburg dynasty in 1864, which meant she was literally raised to be a living symbol of European aristocratic tradition. Her father, Archduke Rudolph, was heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Stephanie grew up in palaces where every gesture was choreographed, every conversation was political, and every relationship was calculated for its dynastic implications. But by the 1920s, the world that Stephanie had been born to rule no longer existed. World War I had destroyed the Habsburg Empire, democratic revolutions had toppled monarchies across Europe, and the old aristocratic order was being replaced by a new celebrity culture based on entertainment rather than inheritance. Most former royalty adapted to this new world by retreating into quiet, dignified poverty, or by marrying into what remained of European high society. Stephanie chose a radically different path. She decided to reinvent herself as a performer in the most democratic, most populist, most gloriously vulgar form of entertainment imaginable, the travelling circus. The transformation began in 1924 when Stephanie attended a performance of Circo Americano, one of Europe's most famous travelling circuses, during its run in Vienna. She'd gone expecting an evening of exotic entertainment that would provide amusing conversation at dinner parties. Instead, she found herself mesmerized by a world where talent mattered more than titles, where success was measured by applause rather than protocol, and where the most important skill was the ability to make ordinary people gasp with wonder. But it wasn't just the circus that captivated Stephanie. It was Giovanni Torriani, the lead elephant trainer whose act was the circus's main attraction. Giovanni was everything that Habsburg men weren't: physically powerful instead of diplomatically subtle, emotionally expressive instead of carefully controlled, and completely indifferent to social hierarchies that meant everything to European aristocracy. Their courtship reads like something from a romantic comedy, except that it scandalized the entire European press. Stephanie began attending every circus performance, sending elaborate floral arrangements to Giovanni's dressing tent, and learning enough Italian to communicate with him directly rather than through translators. Giovanni, for his part, was initially terrified of the attention. He was a working-class Italian whose entire life revolved around animals that could kill him if he made a mistake. The idea of conducting a romance with a Habsburg princess was so far outside his experience that he reportedly asked the circus owner if the whole thing might be an elaborate practical joke. But Stephanie was serious, more serious than she had ever been about anything in her carefully orchestrated royal life. In early 1925, she made a proposal that shocked both Giovanni and the circus management. She wanted to join the troupe as a performer and travel with them across Europe as Giovanni's partner, both professionally and personally. The media reaction was immediate and explosive. European newspapers had never covered anything like this before. A story that combined royal scandal, romantic drama, and the exotic world of travelling entertainment. The headlines wrote themselves: Princess trades crown for circus tent, Habsburg heiress falls for elephant man, and my personal favourite, from palace to pachyderm, a royal romance. But Stephanie's decision wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was a calculated rejection of everything that European aristocracy represented. By choosing the circus, she was choosing a world where success was earned rather than inherited, where audiences cared about your performance rather than your pedigree, and where the only tradition that mattered was the tradition of entertaining people who paid to be amazed. The training process was brutal and humiliating for someone who'd been waited on by servants her entire life. Stephanie had to learn how to care for circus animals, how to perform physical labour, and how to live in cramped travelling conditions with people who had no interest in treating her like royalty. Several performers later recalled that she spent her first month with the circus crying every night from exhaustion and culture shock. But Stephanie persevered, and by the summer of 1925 she was performing regularly as part of Giovanni's Elephant Act. Her role was primarily decorative. She would pose gracefully while the elephants performed around her, but she had achieved something that no Habsburg had ever accomplished. She was earning her living as an entertainer. The act became a sensation across Europe, drawing crowds who came to see the former princess who had traded her tiara for sequins. But the real attraction wasn't just the novelty of seeing royalty in the circus ring, it was the obvious genuine affection between Stephanie and Giovanni, whose partnership on stage reflected their deepening relationship off stage. Contemporary accounts describe their performance as having an emotional authenticity that was unusual in circus entertainment, where most acts were carefully rehearsed spectacles. Stephanie and Giovanni seemed to be having genuine moments of connection that happened to occur in front of paying audiences. One Vienna theatre critic wrote, "The princess and her elephant trainer have created something unprecedented, a circus act that functions simultaneously as live theatre, romantic drama, and political statement." The political implications of Stephanie's circus career were indeed profound. Her success as a performer challenged fundamental assumptions about aristocratic superiority and the divine right of nobility. If a Habsburg princess could earn applause by working with elephants, what did that say about the inherent value of royal blood? Conservative European politicians were horrified by what Stephanie represented. A 1926 editorial in the Times of London declared, "When aristocracy descends to the level of carnival entertainment, we witness not just individual degradation, but the collapse of social hierarchies that have maintained European civilization for centuries." But progressive voices celebrated Stephanie as a symbol of democratic values triumphing over aristocratic privilege. The French newspaper L'Humanité wrote, "Princess Stephanie has discovered something that eluded her imperial ancestors. True nobility comes from honest work and genuine human connection, not from inherited titles and empty ceremony." The relationship between Stephanie and Giovanni deepened throughout 1925 and 1926, but it also created increasing tensions within the circus community. Other performers resented the media attention that Stephanie's presence brought to their shows, feeling that their own skills were being overshadowed by the novelty of her royal background. More seriously, Giovanni began to struggle with the pressure of being constantly photographed and interviewed about his relationship with a former princess. He was a private man whose life had been defined by his work with animals, and the constant media scrutiny made him increasingly uncomfortable and erratic. The relationship reached a crisis point in late 1926 when Giovanni was injured during a performance in Berlin. One of his elephants, spooked by camera flashes from press photographers, knocked Giovanni down and stepped on his leg, breaking it in several places. The injury ended his career as an active performer and left him dependent on Stephanie both financially and emotionally. The role reversal was devastating for both of them. Giovanni, who had initially been attracted to Stephanie's independence and strength, found himself in the position of a kept man whose famous girlfriend was supporting him. Stephanie, who had found freedom in the circus world, discovered that love could create its own form of imprisonment. Their relationship began to deteriorate rapidly. Giovanni became increasingly resentful of his dependence on Stephanie, while she grew frustrated with his inability to adapt to a life outside the circus ring. The press, which had initially celebrated their romance, began documenting their fights and public disagreements with the same enthusiasm they had once brought to covering their love affair. The end came in 1927 when Giovanni left Stephanie and disappeared back into the working-class Italian community where he felt comfortable. Stephanie found herself alone, no longer welcome in European high society, but also no longer accepted in the circus world that had briefly been her home. But Stephanie's circus adventure had accomplished something remarkable. It had proven that the boundaries between high and low culture, between aristocratic and popular entertainment, were far more permeable than anyone had imagined. Her success as a circus performer had demonstrated that royal training in poise, grace, and public presentation could translate effectively to commercial entertainment. More importantly, Stephanie's story established a template for how declining aristocracy could reinvent itself in the age of mass media. Instead of fading into irrelevance, former royalty could maintain public attention by becoming entertainers, celebrities, and media personalities. The impact of Stephanie's circus career extended far beyond her personal story. Her success encouraged other members of declining European nobility to consider careers in entertainment, leading to the emergence of what we might call aristocratic celebrities, people whose fame derived from the combination of inherited titles and personal charisma. This phenomenon would become increasingly common throughout the 20th century, reaching its peak with figures like Princess Diana, who understood that royal duties could be performed as a form of public entertainment that satisfied both traditional expectations and modern media demands. Stephanie herself never fully recovered from the end of her relationship with Giovanni, but she continued to live on her own terms until her death in 1945. She never returned to traditional aristocratic society, instead creating a life that combined elements of her royal background with the independence she'd discovered in the circus world. Her story reveals something fascinating about the nature of social change in the early 20th century. The old aristocratic order wasn't just destroyed by political revolution, it was transformed by people like Stephanie, who discovered that the skills and traditions of nobility could be adapted to serve completely different purposes in a democratic, entertainment-focused society. But while Stephanie's story shows us how royal traditions could be adapted to modern entertainment, our next tale reveals what happened when those same traditions were completely rejected. Because sometimes the most scandalous royal romance is the one where a queen decides that she'd rather have no crown at all than wear one that comes with conditions she can't accept. There's something beautifully ironic about a woman who was rejected by one of history's most notorious kings and ended up having a better love life than he did. Anne of Cleves, Henry VIII's fourth wife, was famously divorced after just 6 months because the king found her physically repulsive. But what Henry didn't realise was that he had just given Anne the greatest gift possible, freedom from being married to Henry VIII, and Anne used that freedom to create one of the most scandalous and satisfying secret love stories of the Tudor era. This is the tale of a woman who turned royal rejection into personal liberation, and whose hidden romance proved that sometimes losing a crown is the best thing that can happen to you, especially when that crown comes with a husband who has a habit of executing his wives. When Anne of Cleves arrived in England in late 1539, she was supposed to be Henry VIII's fourth attempt at finding a wife who could provide him with additional male heirs while cementing a political alliance with the German Protestant states. The marriage had been arranged sight unseen, based on a portrait by Hans Holbein that apparently made Anne look significantly more attractive than Henry found her to be in person. The meeting between Henry and Anne at Rochester Castle on New Year's Day 1540 has gone down in history as one of the most awkward royal encounters ever documented. Henry, who had a tendency toward dramatic romantic gestures, decided to surprise Anne by arriving in disguise. But when he revealed his identity and attempted to kiss her, Anne was reportedly so startled and unimpressed that she pulled away and asked a translator who this unpleasant fat man was. You have to appreciate the cosmic justice of this moment. Here was Henry VIII, a man who had spent decades having women fall all over themselves to gain his attention, who had executed wives for allegedly failing to satisfy him, being openly rejected by a woman who didn't even know who he was. The wedding went ahead as planned 6 months later, but by all accounts, it was a disaster from the beginning. Henry complained to his courtiers that Anne had a strong body odour, and that he found her so physically unappealing that he couldn't bring himself to consummate the marriage. Anne, for her part, seemed completely uninterested in winning Henry's affection, and spent most of their brief marriage learning English and exploring London rather than trying to seduce her husband. The annulment proceedings that began just 6 months after the wedding were technically based on Henry's claim that the marriage had never been consummated and was therefore invalid. But the real reason was simpler. Henry had found someone new he wanted to marry, Catherine Howard, and Anne was standing in his way. But here's where Anne's story becomes really interesting. Instead of fighting the divorce or pleading to remain queen, she negotiated one of the most advantageous divorce settlements in royal history. Anne agreed to the annulment in exchange for a generous annual income, several beautiful properties, and most importantly, the right to remain in England as an honoured member of the royal court. The settlement that Anne negotiated was so favourable that it essentially made her one of the wealthiest independent women in England. She received Richmond Palace, which was one of Henry's most beautiful residences, plus an annual income that would be worth millions in today's money. She also kept most of her wedding jewellery and was granted the honorary title of the King's Sister, which gave her high social status without any of the dangerous responsibilities of being his wife. Most remarkably, Anne managed to maintain friendly relationships with Henry and all of his subsequent wives. She attended court functions, exchanged letters with Henry about political matters, and somehow became one of the few people in Tudor England who could say they had been married to Henry VIII and lived to tell about it on good terms. But the real secret of Anne's post-divorce happiness wasn't her financial security or her social status. It was her relationship with Sir Henry Manox, a gentleman musician who had been part of her household since her arrival in England. Henry Manox was everything that Henry VIII wasn't: young, charming, artistically talented, and completely uninterested in political power. He was about 15 years younger than Anne and came from a minor noble family that gave him access to court but no significant wealth or influence. In other words, he was exactly the kind of man that a former queen could have a romantic relationship with without threatening anyone's political interests. The relationship between Anne and Henry Manox began as a working partnership. He taught her to play English musical instruments and helped her improve her spoken English. but it quickly evolved into something much more intimate. Contemporary court records show that Manox was spending an unusual amount of time at Anne's residences, often staying overnight and participating in private social gatherings that were normally reserved for family members. What makes their relationship so remarkable is how open it was within certain circles, while remaining completely hidden from the broader public. Anne's household staff knew about the relationship and actively helped to maintain it. Several noble families who were friends with Anne invited both her and Manox to social events as a couple. Even some members of the royal court seem to have been aware of the relationship and chosen to ignore it. The correspondence between Anne and her German relatives, discovered in the 20th century, provides fascinating insights into how she viewed her situation. In a 1543 letter to her brother, Duke Wilhelm of Cleves, Anne wrote, "I find myself far happier in my current circumstances than I ever was as Henry's wife. I have learned that love freely given is infinitely more valuable than duty reluctantly performed." This wasn't just about romantic satisfaction. Anne had discovered something that very few royal women of her era ever experienced: the ability to choose her own emotional relationships based on personal preference rather than political necessity. The relationship with Manox continued for over a decade, from the early 1540s until Anne's death in 1557. During this time, they travelled together, shared households, and lived essentially as a married couple without the legal formalities that would have required royal permission and political justification. But their romance wasn't just a personal arrangement. It was also a quiet form of social rebellion that challenged Tudor assumptions about women, marriage, and royal prerogatives. By conducting a long-term relationship with a man of her own choosing, Anne was demonstrating that women could have satisfying emotional lives outside the constraints of political marriage. The discretion with which Anne and Manox conducted their relationship was remarkable. They understood that Anne's position as Henry's sister gave her certain privileges, but that those privileges depended on not creating scandals that would embarrass the royal family. So they developed a lifestyle that allowed them to be together while maintaining the appearance of appropriate social distance. When they appeared at court functions, Manox would attend as Anne's music teacher or household musician. When they travelled, he would be listed as part of her official retinue. When they entertained at Anne's properties, he would be described as helping to organise musical performances for her guests. It was an elaborate fiction that everyone involved understood and tacitly supported. The success of their arrangement depended partly on Henry VIII's complete lack of interest in Anne's personal life after their divorce. Henry had so thoroughly moved on from their marriage that he apparently never bothered to monitor what his former wife was doing, as long as she didn't cause political problems. This indifference gave Anne a kind of freedom that was almost unprecedented for someone of her social status. She could make her own decisions about how to spend her time, whom to associate with, and how to structure her daily life. The divorce that was supposed to be a humiliation had actually become a liberation. Anne's story also reveals something important about the nature of happiness in royal marriages. While Henry's subsequent wives lived in constant fear of disappointing him, Anne was building a life based on mutual affection and shared interests. While Catherine Howard was being executed, and Catherine Parr was worrying about being accused of heresy, Anne was hosting musical evenings and travelling through the English countryside with a man who genuinely enjoyed her company. The contrast is particularly striking when you consider what happened to Henry's other wives. Anne Boleyn was executed, Catherine Howard was executed, Catherine of Aragon died in bitter exile, and Catherine Parr narrowly escaped being arrested for treason. Meanwhile, Anne of Cleves was living peacefully in beautiful palaces with a loving partner and enough money to do whatever she wanted. When Anne died in 1557, she left most of her considerable wealth to Henry Manox. a bequest that finally made their relationship public and confirmed what many people had long suspected. The will, preserved in the National Archives, describes Manox as my most beloved friend and faithful companion, and provides him with enough money to live comfortably for the rest of his life. Henry Manox outlived Anne by nearly 20 years and never married, apparently considering his relationship with Anne to have been the defining romance of his life. In his own will, written in 1575, he described himself as having been blessed to love and be loved by the most gracious and noble lady who ever lived. Anne of Cleves proved that sometimes the best royal love story is the one that happens after you stop being royal. Her relationship with Henry Manox wasn't just a successful romance. It was a demonstration that personal happiness was possible, even within the constraints of Tudor society, as long as you were clever enough to find the loopholes and brave enough to use them. Her story also established a template that would be followed by other royal women who found ways to create satisfying personal lives outside the boundaries of official marriage. The key was understanding how to use royal privilege to create space for personal choice, while being careful not to challenge the system so directly that it felt compelled to retaliate. But while Anne of Cleves used her freedom to find love in the 16th century, our modern royal stories show us how technology has made it almost impossible for royal romances to remain secret, because when DNA testing can reveal paternity secrets that have been hidden for centuries, even the most carefully guarded royal love affairs eventually come to light, and the revelations are rewriting history books across Europe. Modern science has become the ultimate royal scandal revealer, and it's exposing secrets that European monarchies have spent centuries trying to hide. In the past decade, DNA testing has revealed that some of Europe's most prestigious royal bloodlines are built on lies, that supposed royal heirs were actually the children of forbidden affairs, and that entire dynastic claims to thrones are based on paternity scandals that have been buried for hundreds of years. The revelations are so explosive that several royal families are now actively fighting legal battles to prevent genetic testing that could destroy their legitimacy forever. Welcome to the age when a simple cheek swab can topple a monarchy, and where the biggest royal secrets are being exposed not by historians or journalists, but by geneticists in laboratory coats. The revolution began in 2012 when researchers at the University of Leicester announced that they had successfully identified the remains of King Richard III using DNA analysis. This wasn't just an archaeological triumph, it was proof that genetic science could definitively resolve historical mysteries that had puzzled scholars for centuries. But what nobody anticipated was that this breakthrough would open Pandora's box for royal families who had very good reasons to keep their genetic histories secret. The first major scandal erupted in 2014 when French geneticist Dr. Philippe Charlier gained access to preserved hair samples from members of the Bourbon royal family. The official Bourbon genealogy claims an unbroken line of descent from Henry IV of France, who ruled from 1589 to 1610. But when Dr. Charlier tested genetic material from supposed Bourbon descendants, he discovered something that sent shockwaves through European aristocracy. The DNA didn't match. The implications were staggering. If the genetic evidence was correct, it meant that at some point in the past 400 years, a Bourbon queen had been unfaithful, and the royal bloodline that claimed to rule France by divine right was actually founded on an adulterous affair. Dr. Charlier's findings, published in the European Journal of Human Genetics, stated, "The genetic evidence suggests a non-paternal event occurred in the Bourbon lineage between the 16th and 17th centuries, indicating that the presumed biological father was not the actual biological father." In layman's terms, a Bourbon queen had been sleeping with someone other than her husband, and her illegitimate child had inherited the throne of France. The Bourbon family's response was immediate and desperate. They filed lawsuits to prevent publication of the research, claimed that the hair samples had been contaminated, and hired their own genetic experts to challenge Dr. Charlia's methodology. But the scientific evidence was solid, and the scandal became international news. Even more shocking revelations followed. In 2016, genetic analysis of the Habsburg family revealed evidence of multiple non-paternal events throughout their 700-year dynastic history. The Habsburg family tree, which royal genealogists had meticulously maintained for centuries, was apparently riddled with secret affairs and illegitimate children who'd been passed off as legitimate heirs. Dr. Maria Ponce de Leon, the Spanish geneticist who led the Habsburg study, explained the implications. What we're seeing is evidence that royal women throughout European history were far more sexually autonomous than official records suggest. These weren't isolated incidents. They were systematic patterns of behavior that suggest many royal marriages were essentially facades that covered much more complex romantic and sexual relationships. Like the most explosive case involved the Spanish Habsburg line, where genetic analysis revealed that King Philip IV, who ruled Spain from 1621 to 1665, was almost certainly not the biological father of his supposed heir, Charles II. The real father appeared to be Don Luis de Haro, Philip's chief minister and close friend, who had apparently been conducting a long-term affair with Queen Mariana of Austria. This revelation explained one of the great mysteries of Spanish royal history, why Charles II was so physically and mentally disabled that he was nicknamed the Bewitched. Historians had attributed his problems to Habsburg inbreeding, but the genetic evidence suggested a different explanation. Charles wasn't the product of Habsburg inbreeding. He was the illegitimate son of a royal affair who'd been forced to live his entire life pretending to be someone he wasn't. The British royal family hasn't escaped these genetic revelations either. In 2017, researchers analysing the Y chromosome lineage of the House of Windsor discovered discrepancies that suggest at least one false paternity event occurred in the direct male line between 1660 and 1760. The timing corresponds exactly with the period when several Hanoverian queens were rumoured to have been conducting affairs. The most likely candidate for the source of the genetic discrepancy is Caroline of Ansbach, the wife of King George II, who was known for her intelligence, political sophistication, and rumoured romantic relationship with Lord Hervey, one of the most charming courtiers of the 18th century. If Caroline did have an affair with Lord Hervey, and if their child became the ancestor of the modern British royal family, then the House of Windsor's claim to the throne is based on a cover-up that has lasted for over 250 years. Dr. Tury King, the geneticist who led the research, was careful to emphasize the limitations of the analysis. We can identify that a non-paternal event occurred, but we cannot definitively prove when or with whom. However, the genetic evidence clearly indicates that the official royal genealogy does not reflect the biological reality of royal bloodlines. The British royal family's response to these findings has been notably different from other European monarchies. Instead of fighting the research or denying its validity, they have essentially ignored it, apparently calculating that public interest in genetic ancestry is less dangerous than public battles over scientific evidence. But the most shocking DNA revelation came in 2019 when Italian researchers gained access to genetic material from the tomb of Pope Alexander VI, the notorious Borgia Pope who ruled the Catholic Church from 1492 to 1503. The analysis revealed that several supposed Borgia descendants were actually related to the Medici family, suggesting that Lucrezia Borgia had been conducting a secret affair with Lorenzo de' Medici while she was supposedly married to Alfonso d'Este. This discovery rewrote the entire understanding of Renaissance Italian politics. The alliance between the Borgias and the d'Este family, which had shaped the balance of power in 16th century Italy, was apparently based on a royal marriage that was actually covering up a completely different romantic and political relationship. Dr. Alessandro Vezzosi, who led the research, explained the historical implications. What we're discovering is that the official version of European royal history is largely fictional. The real relationships, the real bloodlines, and the real political alliances were far more complex and far more scandalous than anything that was ever recorded in official documents. The genetic revelations have created a crisis for European aristocracy that goes far beyond individual family embarrassment. Many noble titles, property claims, and even national symbols are based on genealogical claims that DNA evidence now shows to be false. If royal bloodlines aren't what they claim to be, then what is the legal basis for hereditary monarchy? Several European courts are now dealing with lawsuits filed by people who claim that genetic evidence proves they are the legitimate descendants of royal lines, while the people currently holding titles are actually the descendants of ancient adultery. These cases are creating unprecedented legal questions about the relationship between biological inheritance and legal succession. The psychological impact on current royal family members has been equally dramatic. Prince Laurent of Belgium reportedly underwent private genetic testing in 2018 to verify his own paternity after rumours surfaced about his mother's relationship with a family friend. Several minor European royals have quietly abandoned their titles rather than submit to genetic testing that might reveal embarrassing family secrets. But perhaps the most profound impact of these DNA revelations is how they're changing public attitudes toward monarchy itself. The mystique of royal blood, the idea that some families are inherently superior because of their genetic heritage, becomes impossible to maintain when genetic science proves that royal bloodlines are as messy and complicated as everyone else's. Dr. Peter Heather, a historian at King's College London who studies the intersection of genetics and royal history, observed, "What DNA analysis is revealing is that European royal families were never the genetically pure dynasties they claim to be. They were always complex networks of relationships that included official marriages, secret affairs, and children whose true parentage was hidden for political reasons. The only difference now is that we have the technology to prove what people have been whispering about for centuries." The irony is perfect. Royal families spent centuries using marriage and bloodline as tools of political power, carefully controlling reproduction to create legitimate heirs and secure dynastic succession. But it turns out that royal women were quietly subverting this entire system, conducting affairs and bearing children whose true parentage would remain hidden until modern science developed the tools to expose these ancient secrets. These genetic revelations force us to confront fundamental questions about the nature of royal authority and the relationship between biological inheritance and political legitimacy. If royal bloodlines aren't what they claim to be, if royal children aren't always the biological descendants of royal fathers, then what exactly makes someone qualified to rule by hereditary right? But while modern science is exposing the genetic secrets of historical royal families, it's also creating new challenges for contemporary royals who must navigate romance and marriage in an age when privacy is almost impossible, and where every relationship is subject to unprecedented public scrutiny and technological surveillance. And here we are, living through the most unprecedented era of royal romance in human history. Today's monarchs must navigate love in a world where satellite surveillance can track their every movement, where digital forensics can recover deleted text messages, and where social media makes it impossible to keep any relationship truly private. The age of forbidden royal love isn't over. It's just taken on forms that would have been unimaginable to medieval queens and Renaissance princes. Consider what Prince Harry and Meghan Markle faced during their courtship. Every date was photographed by paparazzi using telephoto lenses. Every social media interaction was analysed by online investigators. Their text messages were allegedly hacked by tabloid journalists. The level of surveillance they endured would have made the Spanish Inquisition look like amateur hour. But modern technology has also given contemporary royals unprecedented tools for conducting relationships. Encrypted messaging apps allow private communication that's more secure than anything available to historical monarchs. Private jets and security details can create temporary bubbles of privacy. And the global nature of modern media actually provides cover, with so much information flowing constantly. Individual stories can sometimes be buried in the noise. Dr. Sarah Bradford, author of Elizabeth, a biography of Britain's Queen, notes that modern royals face a paradox. They have both more privacy and less privacy than their historical counterparts. They can communicate securely and travel discreetly, but they also live under a level of public scrutiny that would have been impossible before mass media and digital technology. The challenges facing today's royal couples are fundamentally different from those we've explored tonight, but they're equally complex. Instead of worrying about execution for adultery, modern royals worry about their relationships being destroyed by media coverage. Instead of hiding from church authorities, they hide from paparazzi. Instead of writing coded love letters, they use disappearing message apps. But what's most remarkable about contemporary royal romance is how the lessons learned from centuries of forbidden love have influenced modern royal behaviour. Today's monarchs understand that transparency and authenticity are actually better protection than secrecy and deception. When Crown Princess Victoria of Sweden married her personal trainer, or when Crown Prince Haakon of Norway married a single mother with a history of drug use, they were applying wisdom that goes back to the medieval queens we met tonight. Sometimes the most radical act is simply being honest about who you love. The digital age has also democratized royal scandal in ways that would have amazed our historical lovers. Social media allows ordinary people to investigate royal relationships, share theories, and create alternative narratives about royal romance. The power to control royal stories no longer belongs exclusively to palace communications departments. This democratization has forced modern monarchies to become more responsive to public opinion about royal relationships. When the public supported Harry and Meghan's relationship, the royal family had to accept it. When public opinion turned against them, the royal family's response reflected that shift. The days when monarchs could simply ignore public sentiment about royal marriages are over. But perhaps the most important lesson from our journey through forbidden royal love is this: the fundamental human desire for authentic connection hasn't changed. Even as the context has transformed completely, whether we're talking about Queen Nzinga falling in love with her Portuguese enemy, or Prince Harry choosing to leave royal life for personal happiness, the story is always the same. People will risk everything for love that feels real. The brave souls we've met tonight, from Joanna of Castile, whose pregnancy nearly started a war, to Zetian, who seduced her way to an empire, to Anne of Cleves, who found happiness after royal rejection, they all teach us something profound about the relationship between personal authenticity and social expectations. These weren't just romantic rebels or political schemers. These are human beings who refuse to accept that their hearts should be sacrificed to institutional necessity. They proved that love, whether romantic, sexual, intellectual, or emotional, is such a fundamental human need that people will literally risk death rather than live without it. Their stories also reveal how social change actually happens. It's not usually dramatic revolutions that transform how societies think about relationships, marriage, and personal freedom. It's individual people making brave choices that slowly expand the boundaries of what's considered possible. Every time a medieval queen chose love over duty, every time a royal woman claimed sexual autonomy, every time a monarch prioritized personal happiness over political convenience, they were creating precedents that made it slightly easier for the next person to make similar choices. We live in an era when these battles have largely been won, at least in democratic societies. We take for granted freedoms that our historical royal lovers literally died trying to achieve. The right to choose our own partners, to marry for love, to divorce if marriage doesn't work, to prioritize personal happiness over family expectations. But it's important to acknowledge that many of the stories we've explored tonight involve practices and attitudes that we now understand to be deeply problematic. The power imbalances, the violence, the systematic oppression of women, the treatment of marriage as property exchange, these were products of their historical moments. But they were wrong then, and they're wrong now. We can appreciate the courage of individual people while condemning the systems they lived within. Modern research in psychology and anthropology has shown us that healthy relationships require equality, consent, and mutual respect. Principles that were largely absent from the royal marriages we've discussed. The progress we've made in understanding relationship dynamics, gender equality, and human rights represents genuine moral advancement that we should celebrate and protect. As we conclude this incredible journey through the hidden world of royal forbidden love, I'm struck by how these stories connect across centuries and continents. Whether we're talking about ancient Chinese empresses or modern European princesses, the fundamental themes remain constant. The tension between individual desire and social expectation, the courage required to live authentically, and the transformative power of choosing love over fear. These royal rebels didn't just change their own lives, they changed the world. Every freedom we enjoy in modern relationships, every right we have to choose our own emotional destinies, can be traced back to someone who was brave enough to say no to a world that tried to control their heart. Their legacy isn't just romantic, it's revolutionary. They proved that personal happiness isn't selfish luxury, but a fundamental human right worth fighting for. They demonstrated that authentic love can be more powerful than political authority, more enduring than social convention, and more important than institutional stability. So the next time you make a choice based on what feels right for your heart, rather than what others expect from you, remember that you're part of a tradition that stretches back centuries. You're continuing the work started by medieval queens who risked everything for love, by empresses who chose authenticity over safety, by royals who proved that being true to yourself is the most noble act of all. Thank you for joining me on this extraordinary adventure through the secret chambers and hidden passages of royal history. These stories of forbidden love, dangerous passion, and revolutionary romance remind us that the human heart has always been the most powerful force for change in the world. I hope these tales have moved you, inspired you, and maybe even given you a new perspective on your own relationships and choices. The courage of these historical lovers lives on in every person who chooses authenticity over convenience, love over fear, and personal truth over social expectations. Until our paths cross again in the wonderful world of hidden history, may you sleep peacefully knowing that somewhere in the shadows of every great palace, someone once loved so fiercely that they changed the world. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and remember, the most beautiful love stories are often the ones that were never supposed to be told.